There is a number that appears on the shoulder of every soldier who has ever served in one of America's oldest and most decorated fighting divisions. Not a name, not a motto, just a number, rendered in bold red against a field of olive drab, a single digit, the number 1. That patch has been worn in the mud of French trenches, on the volcanic beaches of Sicily, in the freezing fog of the Hürtgen Forest, and on the blood-soaked sands of a Norman beach that the world would come to know simply as Omaha. Soldiers who wore it were not always celebrated when they first arrived somewhere. They were sometimes laughed at, underestimated, dismissed as raw and unprepared. But there is something that tends to happen when men who wear that patch are pushed far enough. Something that enemies across more than a century of warfare eventually came to understand, often too late. They fight, they hold, and they do not stop. This is the story of the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, told from the very beginning. Before we go any further, if you have found this documentary and you are the kind of person who loves deep history, long-form storytelling, and the kind of detail that most channels simply do not have the patience for, then this channel was built for you. Hit that subscribe button and settle in, because what follows is the complete history of one of the most consequential military formations in the history of the United States, and arguably in the history of modern warfare itself. The story begins not in some great theater of celebrated victory, but in the particular kind of chaos that defines all new beginnings. The year is 1917. America has just entered a war it spent 3 years trying to avoid. The country's military establishment is, by the standards of the European powers already locked in industrial-scale slaughter, almost embarrassingly small. There are men in Washington who understand that this will need to change, and change quickly. What they need, urgently, desperately, is a division, a real one that can be shipped across the Atlantic and placed alongside French and British allies who have already been bleeding for 3 years and are running short of the one thing no army can manufacture: endurance. Out of that pressure, that urgency, and that organizational chaos, the 1st Infantry Division is born at Fort J, New York. It is built almost from nothing. Regulars mixed with volunteers, officers scrambling to impose order on formations that barely exist yet on paper, let alone in the field. The men who would eventually wear that red numeral 1 on their shoulders are, in these first weeks, simply Americans. Farmers, factory workers, clerks, and laborers, most of whom have never fired a military weapon in anger and have no real concept of what awaits them across the Atlantic. They will learn. The Western Front is a brutal teacher. What makes the story of the 1st Infantry Division so remarkable, not in the easy, hollow sense of that word, but in the truest sense, is not simply that they fought in so many wars. Many divisions did that. What makes the big red one different is how they fought, and what those fights cost them, and how the lessons of each successive conflict were carried forward into the next one. This is a formation that was forged, broken, rebuilt, and forged again, across more than a century of American history. It is a story of men learning, sometimes the hardest possible way, what modern warfare actually demands of a human body, a human mind, and a human institution. We will follow them through the trenches of the Somme, where the smell of mustard gas and the sound of German artillery taught them in weeks what military academies had failed to teach in years. We will follow them through the 100 Days Offensive of 1918, where they pushed and pushed until the German line finally broke. We will follow them across the Atlantic again, a generation later, to the beaches of North Africa, where, let us be honest, things did not go especially well at first. Where a division that believed it was ready discovered very quickly that believing you are ready and actually being ready are 2 entirely different things. We will follow them through Tunisia, through the baking heat and the shock of German panzer warfare, through Sicily, where amphibious operations tested everything commanders thought they knew, through mainland Italy, where the terrain itself seemed to have sided with the enemy, and then, and this is where the story reaches one of its most defining moments, to a stretch of French coastline on the 6th of June, 1944, Omaha Beach. There are moments in history that are so thoroughly documented, so frequently depicted, that they risk becoming almost abstract, images we have seen so many times that the human reality behind them grows faint. This documentary will not allow that to happen. When we reach Normandy, we will put you back on that beach, not in the sanitized version, not in the commemorative version, in the version that the men of the 1st Infantry Division actually experienced. The confusion, the fire, the weight of soaking wet equipment, the realization that the plan had not survived contact with the beach, and the choice that faced every man who made it to the waterline: stay down or move forward. They moved forward. From Normandy, we will follow them east, through the hedgerow country of Normandy, through the breakout, through the pursuit of a retreating German army, to the fortified western wall of Germany itself. We will stand with them at Aachen, the first major German city to fall to Allied forces. We will feel the cold of the Ardennes in December 1944, when a German offensive tore through Allied lines and threatened to unravel everything. And we will follow them across the Rhine, into the collapsing Reich, until the guns finally fell silent in the spring of 1945. But the story does not end in 1945. It never ends that cleanly for a division like this one. There is Korea, where the 1st Infantry Division would face yet another brutal education, this time in a peninsula most Americans could barely locate on a map, fighting an enemy they had badly underestimated, in conditions that stripped warfare back to its most primitive and unforgiving essentials. There is the Cold War, with its long garrison years and its quiet vigilance. There is Vietnam. There is a legacy that stretches across more than a century of American military history and continues to this day. The Big Red One is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a living institution, a community of memory. Every soldier who has ever worn that red numeral 1 on their shoulder has inherited something, a tradition of stubbornness, of resilience, of the particular kind of pride that does not come from easy victories, but from surviving the hardest ones. Over the course of this documentary, we are going to honor that inheritance properly, with facts, with honesty about the failures as well as the triumphs, with the respect that real history deserves, not the polished, mythologized version, but the one that includes the chaos and the mistakes, and the men who did extraordinary things, not because they were extraordinary to begin with, but because the moment demanded it of them. So find yourself a comfortable position. Let the world outside go quiet for a while, because we are going back to the very beginning, to Fort J, New York, in the tumultuous year of 1917, and we are going to follow the 1st Infantry Division all the way to the end. This is the complete history of the Big Red One. There is a place where rivers meet the sea, where the Atlantic grinds against the edge of a city that never quite sleeps, and where, in the spring of 1917, something new was being born inside the old stone walls of Fort J. New York Harbor spread out in every direction. Merchant vessels, ferries, the gray geometry of warships at anchor, and on the grounds of Governor's Island, regular army men stood in formations that looked, to any honest observer, less like a fighting division and more like the beginning of one. They were professionals, most of them, men who had done time on the border with Mexico, men who had chased Pancho Villa through the dust of Chihuahua and come back with nothing but hard miles in their boots. They were the raw material. What the United States Army intended to build from them was something this country had not fielded in a generation: a full-strength, modern infantry division, capable of fighting on the European continent against one of the most formidable armies the world had ever assembled. The United States had entered the First World War on the 6th of April, 1917. Congress had debated, the newspapers had raged, and the President had spoken. But a declaration of war and an army capable of winning one are two very different things, and Washington knew it. The country's standing army at that moment numbered fewer than 200,000 men, scattered across garrisons from the Philippines to Panama, to the plains of Texas. There was no expeditionary force waiting to sail. There were no fully organized divisions. There was intention, there was urgency, and there was the terrifying pressure of allies who had already been bleeding for nearly 3 years and could not bleed much longer. What was needed was a formation that could be organized, trained, and shipped to France fast enough to matter. The 1st Expeditionary Division, what would become, in time, the 1st Infantry Division, was the Army's answer to that pressure. The orders came quickly, as wartime orders tend to do. In late May of 1917, the formal call went out to assemble the division at Fort J, drawing on existing infantry regiments, artillery units, and support elements that the Army already had on hand. These were not phantom units conjured from paperwork. The regiments that formed the backbone of this new division carried histories of their own, service in the Philippines along the Rio Grande, in the small, hard campaigns that the Army fought in the margins of the 19th century. When those men mustered at Governor's Island and at the parade grounds where they were directed to form, they brought with them something that would prove invaluable in the months ahead: experience. Not the experience of trench warfare, which none of them had, but the experience of discipline, of marching, of following orders under conditions that were not comfortable and not clean. Building a division from scratch, even from experienced pieces, is not a clean process. It never has been. The staff officers tasked with organization faced a cascade of problems that arrived faster than solutions could be written. Equipment was short, critically so. Rifles were in adequate supply, but machine guns, artillery pieces, and the specialized tools of modern warfare existed in numbers far below what a full division required. Transportation was a confusion. Horses, wagons, and the first tentative motor vehicles competed for space and priority in a system that had not been designed to scale this quickly. Signal equipment was inadequate. Medical supplies were budgeted for a peacetime army, not a division about to enter the most lethal war in human history. Men who had been assigned to the division from other postings arrived at Fort J to find that their records had not. Clerks worked through the nights. Officers argued over tables of organization that were being revised even as they were being distributed. The commanders who were tasked with forging order from this machinery were themselves being shaped by forces beyond their control. In those earliest weeks, the division passed through more than one set of hands, as the Army sorted through its senior officer corps, trying to match men to missions in a service that had not prepared for war on this scale. The pressures on those in charge were immense. They were accountable upward to a chain of command that wanted results, and downward to soldiers who wanted equipment, food, direction, and some indication that someone above them knew what they were doing. Holding that tension together, day after day, in the institutional noise of a formation being built from the ground up, required a particular kind of endurance that is not found in any training manual. Into this situation stepped the men of the volunteer and regular Army drafts alike. The Army had turned to conscription almost immediately. The Selective Service Act passed in May of 1917, and the draft machinery ground into motion. Young men from farms in the Midwest, from the tenements of eastern cities, from mill towns in the Carolinas and mining camps in Pennsylvania, received their notices and reported to induction stations where they were examined, clothed, and sent to camps that were themselves still under construction. The 1st Division drew from this pool even as it drew from the regulars, and the combination created something socially complex. Veteran non-commissioned officers with a decade of service standing next to boys who had never fired a weapon, trying to build cohesion out of a population that had, weeks earlier, shared nothing more than a nationality. Training was fierce, compressed, and conducted against a clock that everyone could feel, but no one could see clearly. The Army did not have the luxury of leisurely preparation. France was sending desperate messages. The British were reeling. Every week of training that extended the deployment date was a week in which the Allies faced the German Army without American reinforcement. So the pace accelerated. Infantry drill, rifle marksmanship, basic tactics, these consumed the daylight hours. Nights brought map reading, first aid instruction, and lectures on the mechanics of the Western Front that most of the instructors had gleaned secondhand from liaison officers and published reports rather than from personal experience. There was, in those training grounds, an almost defiant belief that American energy and American will could substitute for what they lacked in specialized knowledge. It was not entirely wrong, but it was not entirely right either, and the Western Front would teach that lesson in the only currency it accepted. The physical environment of that summer and autumn of 1917 was merciless in its own way. Heat pressed down on the drill fields. Men in wool uniforms moved through exercises that left them soaked through by mid-morning. Supply shortfalls meant that some units trained with wooden stand-ins for weapons they did not yet possess. Machine gun crews drilled on mounts without guns. Artillerymen practiced loading and laying on pieces that were not yet issued. The incongruities of it, the gap between the gravity of what they were preparing for and the inadequacy of what they had to prepare with, was not lost on the men who lived inside it. And yet the formations held together, because the alternative was unthinkable, and because the Army's culture of discipline had its own momentum that carried men forward, even when the logic of their situation might have suggested despair. Through the summer, transport ships were being readied. Orders were drafted, revised, classified, and partially leaked. Rumors moved through the division with the efficiency of a field telephone network. They were sailing in August, no, September, no, the end of October. Wives and families who had followed their soldiers to New York waited in the boarding houses of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn for news that came slowly and meant less than it promised. The men wrote letters they were not certain would arrive before they did. There was, in all of this, the peculiar suspended quality of a moment between what a thing has been and what it is about to become, an army in the act of transformation, not yet tested, not yet proven, carrying within itself both the confidence of men who believe they can fight and the uncertainty of men who have never had to find out. By the time the division began boarding transports in the late summer and early autumn of 1917, it was not yet what it would need to be. Its officers were still learning their headquarters staffs. Its supply chains were still improvised. Its soldiers still contained men who had not finished their training, who had qualified on the rifle range just days before embarkation, who were crossing an ocean to face an enemy they had studied in briefings, but never encountered. And yet there was something real here, something that had coalesced out of all the chaos and the shortfall and the breakneck pace. These men shared, now, a unit. They shared an identity that was still forming, still nameless in the way that matters, the name that soldiers give to themselves through what they do, not through what they are assigned. That name would come from France. It would come from the Western Front, from the mud of the trenches, from the shock of artillery, from the first engagements that would strip away theory and replace it with the hard, specific knowledge of what it costs to fight and to hold. The red numeral on the shoulder patch was already there. The reputation that would make it mean something had not yet been earned. That earning was about to begin. They came across the Atlantic in transports crowded with men who had never heard artillery fired in anger. The 1st Division reached the French port of Saint-Nazaire in the summer of 1917, not 1918 as the headlines back home might have suggested. The crossing itself was only the beginning of a far longer journey toward combat readiness. France greeted them with mud, unfamiliar accents, and the distant rumble of a war that had already consumed millions of lives across 4 years of industrialized slaughter. The men who disembarked on those docks were regulars and volunteers, farm boys and city workers, all of them carrying rifles, but precious few of them carrying any real understanding of what the Western Front demanded. The French and British officers who observed their arrival were polite, but behind closed eyes lay a quiet skepticism. These Americans were enthusiastic, even eager, but enthusiasm had already proven, time and again, to be one of the first casualties of the trenches. The division spent the remaining months of 1917 in a state of accelerating education. French instructors walked American officers through the geometry of trench warfare, The placement of machine gun nests, the architecture of dugouts, the principles of artillery coordination that had evolved through years of catastrophic trial and error. The men learned to sleep in short, interrupted intervals, to read the sound of incoming shells, to exist in conditions that seemed designed to reduce human beings to their most elemental instincts. Training areas in the Lorraine sector became classrooms without walls, where every lesson carried the implicit understanding that failure in the examination would not mean a failing grade, but a body in the mud. The division's leadership worked hard to translate French and British doctrine into terms that American soldiers could absorb quickly. The clock was always running, and everyone in the chain of command understood it. Major General Robert Lee Bullard commanded the 1st Division with a particular brand of demanding exactness. He was not a man given to sentiment, nor one who confused compassion with leniency. Bullard believed that harshness in training was mercy in battle, and he drove his officers and men accordingly, measuring readiness not in morale speeches, but in the concrete details of fire discipline, unit cohesion, and the ability to follow orders under conditions that dissolved every instinct except the instinct to run. He had studied warfare with the same methodical care that a craftsman studies a trade, and he applied that knowledge without apology. Under his hand, the division began to take on a quality that extended beyond its individual soldiers, a collective identity, a unit character that would prove as important as any piece of equipment it carried into the line. The men did not always love him, but they respected him, and in the currency of the Western Front, respect was worth considerably more than affection. The 1st Division entered the trenches for the first time in the autumn of 1917, initially in a quiet sector alongside French forces who would serve as both guides and evaluators. The experience of standing watch in a real trench, hearing the particular silence that preceded enemy activity, was different from anything training had prepared them for. It was not simply the physical danger, but the psychological texture of it, the sense that the ground itself was hostile, that darkness meant something different here than it did anywhere else on Earth. Their French counterparts watched with the measured curiosity of veterans observing novices, occasionally stepping in to correct a mistake before it became fatal. The Americans learned with the particular intensity of men who understood that their instructors had earned their knowledge through losses they did not wish to repeat. Casualties began to accumulate, small at first, the kind of numbers that appear as footnotes in official reports but represent entire futures erased from the world. By the early months of 1918, the character of the war had shifted in ways that increased pressure on every Allied formation. The Great German Spring Offensive, launched in March of that year, tore open sections of the Western Front that had held for years and sent shockwaves through Allied command structures. The Americans were no longer observers working toward eventual commitment. They were needed, and they were needed with a speed that their training schedule had not fully anticipated. The 1st Division found itself drawn deeper into the operational planning of Allied commanders who were managing a crisis with whatever resources they could consolidate. The weight of that pressure filtered down through every level of command, and the men in the trenches felt it, even when no one spoke it aloud. The war was not waiting for anyone to be ready. It was in the village of Cantigny in late May of 1918 that the 1st Division wrote its first clear line in the history of American arms. The village sat atop a low ridge in the Picardy region, held by German forces who used its elevation to observe Allied positions across a wide arc. Allied planners identified it as an objective whose capture would demonstrate American combat capability and straighten a troublesome section of the line. The operation was assigned to the 1st Division, and specifically to the 28th Infantry Regiment, which would lead the assault with artillery support, carefully coordinated with French gun batteries. In the pre-dawn darkness before the attack, the men moved into position with the kind of focused quiet that settles over soldiers in the hours before an assault, a silence composed not of calm but of contained tension. The artillery preparation that preceded the infantry assault was, by the standards of the Western Front, a carefully designed operation. French gunners and American artillerists worked in coordination to suppress German positions and cut the wire that defended the village approaches. When the infantry moved forward on the morning of the 28th of May 1918, they advanced behind a rolling barrage in the French method, a curtain of shell fire that moved ahead of them at a measured pace, designed to keep German defenders pinned below ground until the American rifles were close enough to settle matters personally. The assault went in with a precision that surprised even some of its planners. The village fell within the span of an hour and a half. For a brief moment, the operation looked like a clean, textbook success. What followed was the harder lesson. The Germans responded with fierce and sustained counterattacks throughout the remainder of the day and into the days that followed, determined to retake the ground they had lost. The men of the 1st Division held Cantigny through artillery barrages that fell with relentless consistency, through counterattacks that came in successive waves, through conditions that stripped away any notion that capturing a position and holding a position were remotely similar problems. Casualties mounted with a speed that was genuinely difficult to absorb, but the line held. When the smoke cleared and the German counterattacks finally exhausted themselves against American positions, Cantigny remained in American hands. It was a small village on a small ridge, significant by almost no military metric except one. It was proof that American soldiers could seize ground and keep it against a determined enemy. The cost was registered in ways that changed the division permanently. Men who had trained together, who had crossed the Atlantic together and learned the rhythms of trench life together, were gone. Some killed outright, others carried back through the medical system that would prove as overwhelmed as anyone had feared. The officers who survived Cantigny carried forward a form of knowledge that could not be taught in any training area, the knowledge of what their men would do when everything depended on them. There is a particular quality to a unit that has been tested and has not broken, and the 1st Division acquired that quality in the fields around Cantigny at a price that no one who paid it would ever have called cheap. The division's reputation within the American Expeditionary Forces changed in the weeks that followed, quietly at first, then with a distinctness that shaped how it would be employed in the operations to come. Through the summer of 1918, as the Allied counteroffensives began to roll back the gains the Germans had made in the spring, the 1st Division continued to operate along the Somme region, fighting the kind of grinding attritional engagements that defined this phase of the war. The tactical lessons accumulated with every operation: how to coordinate infantry and artillery more effectively, how to manage the communication failures that plagued every assault, how to maintain unit integrity in terrain that seemed designed to scatter and disorient. Bullard pressed his staff and his regimental commanders for analysis after every engagement, treating each operation as data to be understood, rather than simply an event to be survived. The division became, through this process, a more capable instrument with each successive engagement, though the price of each lesson was measured in lives. The men themselves underwent a transformation that resisted simple description. They had arrived in France as soldiers in a technical sense, trained, equipped, organized. They returned from each engagement as something more specific, veterans of a particular kind of combat, men shaped by experiences that created a shared understanding no external observer could fully access. The dark humor that emerges in any fighting force under sustained pressure became part of the 1st Division's internal culture, a way of processing what could not be processed directly. Letters home described what could be described and omitted what could not, which meant that families in America received accounts that were simultaneously true and fundamentally incomplete. The gap between what the soldiers knew and what anyone at home could imagine would define the veterans of this war for the rest of their lives. By the time the 100 Days Offensive began to reshape the final phase of the war, the 1st Division stood as one of the most experienced American formations in France. What had begun as an organizational concept at Fort J, a regular army division built from regulars and volunteers, organized in the months after American entry into the war, had become something real and specific and hard-earned. The months of training, the education in French trenches, the shock of Cantigny, and the grinding operations that followed, All of it had produced a division that Allied commanders could place in a difficult sector with a reasonable expectation that it would perform. That reputation had been built at considerable cost, and every man who wore the division's shoulder patch understood, in a way that required no articulation, exactly what the cost had been. The big red one had found its character in the mud and fire of the Western Front, and it would carry that character forward into everything that was still to come. By the summer of 1918, the war on the Western Front had entered its most brutal and consequential phase. Germany's great spring offensives had burned through the last reserves of an empire already hollowed out by 4 years of total war. The German armies had gained ground in those offensives, pushing closer to Paris than at any point since 1914, but the cost had been catastrophic. Divisions that had once been the finest fighting force on earth were now under strength, exhausted, and increasingly reliant on boys and old men to fill their ranks. The Allied commanders, watching this deterioration with careful eyes, sensed that the moment for a decisive counterstroke was finally at hand. Ferdinand Foch, now Supreme Allied Commander, had been marshalling his forces and his nerve. And the 1st Division, bloodied and tempered by everything the Western Front had thrown at it, was exactly the kind of formation he would need when the blow finally fell. The offensive that would end the war began in earnest with the Franco-American attack at Soissons in mid-July. When Foch ordered the counteroffensive, the 1st Division was not given time to ease into the fight. It went in hard, alongside French formations, striking across terrain that offered little natural cover and a great deal of German firepower. The shock of the assault was the point. Speed and aggression, not patience and consolidation. The men of the 1st had learned, painfully and at great cost, how to move across contested ground, how to use terrain, how to suppress a machine gun nest and not simply die charging it. Those lessons, bought with lives at Cantigny and through the grinding weeks that followed, now had to be applied at scale and at speed. The German line, which had seemed so immovable for so long, began, for the first time in years, to actually break. What followed over the next weeks became known as the 100 Days Offensive, though no one called it that at the time. To the men living inside it, it was simply the war refusing to stop. There was no clean sequence of battles with days of rest between them. There was movement, contact, fire, advance, consolidation, and then movement again. The world of northern France, already churned beyond recognition by years of bombardment, became the backdrop for an almost continuous rolling engagement. Roads clogged with troops, horses, artillery, and the wreckage of both sides. Villages changed hands and changed again. Columns of exhausted men shuffled forward in the dark, following guides who were barely more certain of direction than they were. The 1st Division's role in this final offensive was substantial and relentless. They were committed to the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the massive Franco-American operation launched in late September that would drive into the heavily fortified German lines between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. This was not a clean breakthrough battle. The terrain was among the most difficult on the entire Western Front. Dense forest, steep ravines, fortified ridges, and a German defense that had been constructed over 4 years into something approaching a permanent fortification system. The Americans, including the 1st Division, were attacking into the throat of a carefully prepared killing ground. The opening days were brutal. Units became separated in the woods. Communication broke down. Artillery coordination, which was the key to survival in this kind of fighting, sometimes lagged dangerously behind the infantry's position. Yet the 1st Division kept pushing. What distinguished them in this period? What began to separate their reputation from that of other American formations was not an absence of the chaos that affected everyone. It was their capacity to function inside it. Leadership at the company and battalion level had been forged through months of actual combat. The junior officers and senior sergeants who drove men forward in the Argonne were not working from manuals. They were applying hard experience, reading ground they had learned to read under fire, making decisions with incomplete information because incomplete information was all anyone ever had. When a flank was exposed, they adapted. When a position could not be taken frontally, they found another way, or held until support arrived. The learning curve that had cost the division so dearly in earlier battles was now producing returns. Casualties continued to mount through October. The numbers were not abstract. They were men known by name, men from the same barracks, the same towns, sometimes the same families. Every gain in the Argonne was measured not just in yards of ground, but in the men who did not walk away from it. Replacements arrived and were absorbed into units that no longer had the luxury of time to properly integrate them. The veterans taught the newcomers what they could, as quickly as they could, knowing that a man who did not understand how to move on a fire-swept slope was a liability to everyone around him. The division was simultaneously fighting a war and training an army, all under conditions that allowed for neither adequate rest nor adequate preparation. That it continued to perform under these circumstances was not accident or inspiration. It was the product of organizational culture, a collective stubbornness that had been built into the division since its earliest days. The Germans on the other side of this fight were not simply breaking and running. German defensive doctrine in this period was sophisticated and adaptive. Where the line bent under American pressure, German commanders gave ground deliberately, falling back to the next prepared position, extracting maximum cost from each yard yielded. Machine gun teams covered withdrawals with lethal precision. Artillery registered on crossroads and approach routes that attackers would have to use. The 1st Division's men were not walking through a collapsing enemy. They were cracking a defense that was still trying, even in retreat, to bleed them white. Every forward position taken had been paid for in full. Through October and into early November, the rhythm of advance continued. The Hürtgen Forest was finally cleared. German forces pulled back toward their own border. Towns and villages that had spent years under occupation suddenly found themselves in the strange and disorienting position of liberation. Allied troops moving through streets where German soldiers had walked only days before. The reception was rarely simple. People who had survived occupation had learned not to trust sudden changes of fortune. They had watched armies advance and retreat before. But as November approached, something in the atmosphere of the front was different. The German withdrawals were no longer tactical. They were becoming something closer to dissolution. Within the 1st Division, the mood was not one of triumph. The men were too tired for triumph. Officers who had been with the division since its formation in 1917 looked around them and counted faces that were no longer there. Total casualties sustained by the division across the full arc of the war had reached figures that would have seemed unthinkable to the recruits who had drilled awkwardly at Fort J barely a year earlier. The division had been fed replacements repeatedly, and those replacements had become casualties in their turn. What remained was not the original formation in any literal sense. It was an identity, a set of hard standards, and a chain of experience that had passed from veteran to newcomer under conditions that left very little room for anything other than the essential. The armistice came on the 11th of November, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning. Along the front, the guns stopped. Men who had spent weeks in near-constant noise found themselves in a silence so complete it was almost physical. There are accounts from veterans across many divisions of simply not knowing, in that first silence, what to do. The body had calibrated itself to the rhythms of the front, the alert, the adjustment, the constant low-level anticipation of violence. When it stopped, there was no immediate euphoria. There was something closer to bewilderment. The war that had consumed every hour of their existence for the better part of 2 years had simply ended, and the men who had fought it were left standing in a field in France, trying to understand what came next. What came next was the long accounting. The 1st Division had fought from its first entry into French trenches through the armistice, without a period of genuine rest from the war's demands. It had participated in engagements that spanned the full tactical range of the Western Front. Trench raiding, set-piece assault, open pursuit, and attritional grinding through fortified terrain. It had made mistakes, corrected them, and made new ones. It had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed a less coherent organization and had emerged not unscathed but functional, and more than functional. It emerged with a reputation that would follow it forward into the peace and beyond. Among the American Expeditionary Forces, the 1st Division standing by the armistice was particular. It had been the first American division to enter the line, the first to take offensive action, and one of the formations most consistently committed to the hardest operations the final offensive had demanded. Other divisions had fought with equal courage in their own engagements, but the 1st had accumulated a continuity of experience and a visible record that placed it in a distinct category. Senior American commanders trusted it, their French allies respected it, and the Germans who had fought against it had no illusions about what it was capable of. A division that had arrived in France as a collection of enthusiastic but inexperienced men, struggling with equipment, doctrine, and basic unit cohesion, had become, through a year and a half of the most demanding warfare in human history, a formation that genuinely warranted the confidence placed in it. That transformation did not happen through inspiration or chance. It happened through combat, loss, adaptation, and the quiet accumulation of hard knowledge that only the front itself could provide. The guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. After more than 4 years of industrial slaughter, the Western Front went quiet in a way that soldiers on both sides struggled to describe. Men who had lived inside the constant percussion of artillery, who had measured time not in hours but in barrages, suddenly found themselves standing in a stillness that felt almost violent in its own right. For the men of the 1st Infantry Division, that silence carried a particular weight. They had bled through the Meuse-Argonne, pushed through shell-cratered forests, and buried their dead in foreign soil. Now the war was over, and they were still standing. What came next was something none of their training had prepared them for. Within days of the armistice, orders reached the division that would carry them further east than any of them had anticipated. The 1st Division was selected as part of the American Third Army's march to occupy a bridgehead on the Rhine River in western Germany. It was not a gesture made lightly. The Allies wanted boots on German soil, a physical, undeniable presence that would make clear to the German people and their government that the armistice was not merely a pause, but a reckoning. The selection of the 1st Division for this duty was a recognition of what the unit had become over the preceding months. It had transformed from a ragged collection of regulars and volunteers into one of the most battle-tested formations in the entire American Expeditionary Forces, and that reputation had not gone unnoticed at the highest levels of command. The march itself began in mid-November of 1918 and covered hundreds of kilometers across Luxembourg and into the German Rhineland. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary undertaking. Columns of men moved through landscapes still scarred by the fighting, then gradually shifted into countryside that the war had barely touched, villages with intact rooftops, church spires that had not been converted into artillery observation posts, roads that had not been churned into mud by shell fire. For many of the soldiers, the contrast was disorienting. They had grown accustomed to a world defined by ruin. Walking through functioning towns, past intact farmhouses and tidy market squares, required a kind of mental adjustment that no order of the day could mandate. The war had ended, but the soldiers carrying it in their bodies and memories were not yet done with it. The division crossed into Germany proper and established its occupation zone along the Rhine, centered on the ancient cathedral city of Koblenz. This was not enemy territory in the conventional sense any longer. The armistice had transformed adversaries into something harder to classify. The German civilians who watched the Americans march through their streets did so with expressions that ranged from sullen resignation to cautious curiosity. The soldiers of the 1st Division had been trained to fight Germans. Now they were asked to govern them, or at least to manage a tense and ambiguous coexistence, while the diplomats in Paris negotiated the terms of a formal peace. It was a role that required a different kind of discipline entirely, and the division's leadership understood that how their men conducted themselves in the coming months would matter as much as any battlefield performance. Major General Robert Lee Bullard, who had guided the division through its early combat engagements, had by this point moved on to higher command. The officer who now carried the division through its occupation duties had to contend with a challenge that was simultaneously mundane and delicate: maintaining military order among tens of thousands of young men who had survived the war and now found themselves billeted in German homes, policing German streets, and interacting daily with a civilian population that was exhausted, hungry, and struggling to understand what defeat actually meant. This required patience and firmness in equal measure. Regulations governing the behavior of American soldiers toward German civilians were strict and, for the most part, enforced. Fraternization was officially prohibited, though the practical limits of that policy became apparent almost immediately. Daily life in the occupation zone settled into a rhythm that bore little resemblance to anything the soldiers had experienced before. There were inspections and drill, guard duties and patrol rotations, administrative requirements that multiplied with each passing week. The Army, having spent years demanding that its men be ready to advance or die, now asked them to stand still and remain professional. Boredom became an adversary in its own right. The division's leadership worked to provide structured activities, including athletic competitions, educational programs, and organized recreation. A newspaper circulated. Lectures were delivered. Men who had been too exhausted to think about anything beyond survival now had time, sometimes too much of it, and the command understood that idle soldiers in a foreign country presented risks of their own. The German population along the Rhine was, in many respects, not what the soldiers had been conditioned to expect. The enemy they had fought in the trenches had been a force, anonymous, dangerous, relentless. The German civilians they now encountered were families, farmers, shopkeepers, elderly men and women who had also been ground down by 4 years of total war. Shortages of food and fuel were acute throughout the winter of 1918 and into 1919, and American soldiers who had grown up with any sense of ordinary human sympathy found themselves in complicated emotional territory. Official policy maintained a firm distance. Human reality, as it always does, complicated the neat lines of regulation. Small acts of exchange, of shared meals or traded goods, of children given chocolate by soldiers who thought of their own younger siblings back home, accumulated quietly alongside the formal architecture of military occupation. The process of negotiating exactly what the occupation would look like unfolded in parallel with the Paris Peace Conference, which convened in January of 1919. The terms being hammered out at Versailles would determine not only the future of Germany, but the conditions under which the American forces would eventually withdraw. From the perspective of the soldiers on the ground in Koblenz, the diplomacy felt impossibly remote. They were managing checkpoints and conducting inspections while heads of government argued over maps and reparation figures in French conference rooms. The uncertainty about when they would go home was a constant low-level pressure on morale. Men had survived the war. They wanted to return to the lives that the war had interrupted, and each month that passed without clear orders, home added weight to that collective impatience. The Army did not remain static during this period. The mobilization of the American Expeditionary Forces began in earnest through the first half of 1919, and the rhythms of the occupation force shifted accordingly. As units were broken up, men discharged, and the overall American presence in Germany gradually contracted. The 1st Division, however, maintained its cohesion and its position longer than many other formations. It was a point of institutional pride, but also a source of friction, as soldiers who saw comrades from other units shipping home ahead of them grew restless and at times openly resentful. Command worked to manage these tensions through a combination of firmness and genuine acknowledgement that the waiting was hard. The division's officers knew their men well enough by this point to understand where the line between discipline and resentment ran. Through the summer and into the autumn of 1919, the American footprint in the Rhineland continued to shrink as the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, formally signed in June, reshaped the political geography of post-war Europe. The occupation zone that had stretched across a significant stretch of western Germany gradually contracted. Units rotated home. Men who had been teenagers when the war began returned to America as veterans in their early 20s, carrying experiences that their families and neighbors at home could barely imagine, let alone fully understand. The great ships that had carried the American expeditionary forces to France now reversed their courses, and the docks in New York and Boston and New Orleans filled with returning soldiers whose homecomings mixed joy with a strangeness that would take years to resolve. The 1st Division's own return was staged over months, with elements of the division departing through the latter part of 1919 and into 1920. There were no singular triumphal moments, no single day when the big red one came home. It was, like so much of what the division had experienced, a process, complicated, drawn out, and marked by the unglamorous logistics of large-scale military movement. When the final elements of the division reached American soil and the occupation chapter formally closed, what remained was something harder to quantify than a campaign ribbon or a battle streamer. The 1st Division had gone to France as an experiment, a proof of concept that America could field a modern army. It had returned as something the country had not quite possessed before, a division with genuine institutional memory, a fighting identity forged under conditions of maximum pressure, and a name that the men who wore its patch carried with them for the rest of their lives. What the Rhine occupation had demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than the combat operations that preceded it, was that military professionalism extended beyond the ability to win battles. The division had governed, managed, observed, and waited, and had done so without disgracing itself or the country it represented. That discipline in peacetime, that capacity to hold the line even when the enemy was boredom and uncertainty, rather than artillery and machine guns, was part of what the big red one would carry into the long decades ahead. The wars were over. The lean years were coming. But the identity had been fixed, forged in the mud of France, and hardened in the cold quiet of the Rhineland winter, and it would not easily be unmade. The men who came home from Germany in 1919 and 1920 returned to a country that wanted nothing more than to forget them. Streets that had erupted with ticker tape and cheering only months before had grown quiet. The doughboys filtered back into civilian life, back to farms and factories, back to cities that had moved on without them. The 1st Infantry Division, which had crossed an ocean, bled through the Meuse-Argonne, and stood guard on the Rhine, now faced a different kind of reckoning entirely. Not the reckoning of artillery and wire, but something quieter and in its own way just as destructive, the reckoning of political indifference. America had bought its victory at enormous cost, and the nation had collectively decided it would not be paying for another one anytime soon. The bill was already being settled in ways that would take years to fully understand. Congress moved with startling speed to dismantle the apparatus it had spent years constructing. The National Defense Act of 1920 attempted to rationalize the situation, to establish a professional standing army with a reserve structure built around lessons learned, but the vision almost immediately collided with fiscal reality. Appropriations dried up before the ink was properly set. The regular army, which in the final months of the war had numbered well over 1 million men in France alone, was cut to a fraction of that strength. The 1st Division, once 10,000 strong in the field and backed by tens of thousands more in support, shrank to a skeletal establishment that could barely fill its own regimental roles. Officers who had commanded battalions in combat found themselves leading companies of men, then half companies, then administrative ghosts of formations that existed mainly on paper. The division endured, but endurance in this context required a particular kind of stubbornness. Fort Hamilton in New York, Fort Sheridan in Illinois, Fort Hamilton again. The garrison postings of the 1920s read like a ledger of reduced expectations. Elements of the 1st Division were scattered across installations that had themselves seen better days. Barracks that had been built in haste during the mobilization of 1917 were now aging without the funds to repair them. Equipment that had crossed to France, done its work, and crossed back was stored, catalogued, and then largely left to deteriorate. The rifles were fine. Bolt-action arms had not suddenly become obsolete, but heavier weapons, artillery pieces, communications equipment, and the fragile supporting technology of modern war were aging in warehouses, while the world outside continued to evolve. Units trained on what they had because no one was sending more. Creativity, at this point, was not a virtue, but a survival mechanism. The officer corps that weathered these years deserves a particular kind of attention, because it was within that corps that the division's future was being slowly and often invisibly shaped. Men who had been lieutenants and captains in the Meuse-Argonne were now captains and majors in peacetime garrisons, and they had years, in some cases a decade or more, to think. The Army's school system, consolidated at Fort Leavenworth and Carlisle Barracks among other installations, kept a modest current of professional education flowing. Officers who might otherwise have stagnated in administrative postings were instead exposed to evolving doctrine, to the emerging arguments about mechanization, air power, and the relationship between fire and maneuver. Not all of them were receptive. Some of the hardened veterans of 1918 were deeply skeptical of what they regarded as theoretical enthusiasm from men who had not crawled through the mud of Cantigny, but others listened, argued, and began to form views that would matter enormously a decade later. The question of mechanization haunted the interwar army with particular persistence. The tank had arrived on the Western Front as a crude and unreliable instrument, more psychological weapon than tactical breakthrough in its earliest forms. By the mid-1920s, theorists both inside and outside the American military were beginning to argue that the tank's moment had not yet truly come, that properly developed, properly supported, and properly integrated with infantry and artillery, armored formations could transform the battlefield. The 1st Division had no tanks of its own and no imminent prospect of receiving any, but the arguments filtered through the school system and through the pages of military journals that circulated among officers with time on their hands and questions on their minds. Men who would one day lead the division in a Second World War were absorbing these arguments in garrison, between inspections and physical training and the grinding routine of institutional peacetime life. Fort Riley in Kansas became one of the central anchors of the division's interwar experience, a sprawling plains installation where cavalry traditions and infantry practicalities met in sometimes awkward combination. The training that occurred there was frequently undermanned and under-equipped, yet the rhythms of professional soldiering persisted. Marksmanship, tactical exercises, map reading, small unit leadership. A private who enlisted in the late 1920s might go weeks without handling anything heavier than his own rifle, might exercise against an imaginary enemy using flags and whistle signals rather than live fire, might attend lectures on artillery coordination without ever hearing a gun fired in anger. It was an impoverished approximation of military readiness, and everyone involved knew it. What saved it from complete futility was the professionalism of the non-commissioned officers and the junior officers who took it seriously anyway, because the alternative was to let the whole enterprise collapse entirely. The Great Depression arrived in 1929 and made everything worse. Federal budgets that had already been squeezed were now under pressure that had no recent precedent. Army appropriations fell further still. Enlistment continued, because for many young American men, the modest certainty of a military wage looked better than the uncertainty outside the gate. The 1st Division absorbed these men, some of them desperate, some of them capable, many of them both, and attempted to train and maintain a professional fighting force with resources that would have embarrassed a moderately well-funded militia. Clothing allowances were cut. Fuel for vehicles was rationed so severely that motor training became almost nominal. There were years during the early 1930s when exercises that required vehicles simply did not occur because there was no authorization to move them. The division soldiered on in the most literal sense, on foot, with what it had. And yet, within that deprivation, something was accumulating that would not be obvious until much later. The officers who navigated these years developed a ferocious practicality about resources, a habit of achieving results with minimal means that would prove directly applicable when the next war came and its opening phases brought chaos and shortage alongside it. They learned to plan without assumptions of abundance, to improvise within constraints, to demand performance from units that were not ideally constituted. A generation of non-commissioned officers grew up in these formations, who understood their men with exceptional intimacy because they had lived alongside them in reduced circumstances for years. Hardship, when it does not destroy an institution, has a way of revealing its bones. The 1st Division's bones were good. By the middle of the 1930s, shifts in the wider world were beginning to register, even within the isolated rhythms of American garrison life. Events in Europe and Asia were difficult to ignore entirely. Germany had rearmed with startling speed under the National Socialist government that took power in 1933, and the Wehrmacht that emerged from that rearmament was a force built around concepts: combined arms, mechanized exploitation, concentrated air support, that American military thinkers had been theorizing about for years without the money to implement. Japan's military ambitions in the Pacific were producing conflicts that offered bitter lessons about modern warfare to anyone paying attention. Inside the 1st Division and across the regular army, those paying attention were a minority, but they were an increasingly purposeful minority, writing staff papers and doctrinal proposals and quietly urging the army to begin preparing for a war that everyone hoped would not come. Fort Devens in Massachusetts brought renewed focus as the decade wore on. Exercises grew marginally better funded, if not dramatically so. New tables of organization were studied and debated. The relationship between infantry, artillery, and the nascent armored branch was being rethought in ways that would eventually reshape the entire division structure of the American Army. The 1st Division, as the nation's senior division in terms of lineage and tradition, occupied a particular place in these deliberations, not always advantageously. Seniority in an institution can mean tradition, but tradition can also mean resistance to change and the arguments within the officer corps between those who trusted the old ways and those pressing for new ones were sometimes bitter. The men pressing for new ones won, slowly, over years. The lean years were not glorious. There is no way to make them so without dishonesty. They were years of professional frustration, institutional poverty, and the peculiar demoralization that comes from knowing you are part of something that matters and watching it be systematically underfunded by people who have decided it does not matter anymore. The soldiers of the 1st Division in this period were not heroes of any conventional kind. They were professionals managing decline with as much dignity as circumstances permitted, keeping the formation alive through sheer stubbornness and institutional loyalty. What they were building, without knowing it, was the foundation that the next decade would require. The arguments they made in classrooms and the habits they cultivated in inadequate training fields, and the relationships they formed across the length of those difficult years, would all come to matter enormously when, at the end of the 1930s, the world changed its mind about whether war was coming, and the 1st Division found itself once again at the beginning of something immense. By the close of the 1930s, the world that American soldiers had fought to make safe was coming apart at the seams. In Europe, Germany had remade itself into something terrifying, a state organized entirely around the projection of military power. In Asia, Japan's armies moved through China with a brutality that shocked those paying attention. The United States watched from a distance, its political class divided between those who recognized the gathering storm and those who refused to name it. The 1st Infantry Division, stationed across a handful of underfunded posts with equipment that belonged to another era, was in no condition to fight anyone. But that was about to change. Not all at once, and not without friction, but the machinery of American mobilization was beginning, slowly and then with gathering speed, to turn. The trigger for serious American rearmament was not a single event, but an accumulation of shocks. When Germany overwhelmed France in the early summer of 1940, a campaign that took fewer than 6 weeks to shatter what many had considered the finest army in Europe, the complacency in Washington cracked open. Here was proof, vivid and undeniable, that a modern, mechanized force could destroy an opponent, not through grinding attrition, but through speed, coordination, and relentless pressure. American military planners who had long argued for expansion now found audiences willing to listen. Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act in the autumn of 1940, the first peacetime draft in American history. Men began reporting in their hundreds of thousands. The question was what to do with them. For the 1st Division, mobilization arrived as a transformation at every level simultaneously. The division's table of organization, the formal blueprint dictating how many men, how many weapons, how many vehicles it required to function, was revised to reflect the hard lessons of European combat. Units that had existed on paper with skeleton crews suddenly required real men to fill real billets. Officers who had spent years commanding companies of 50 or 60 men now found themselves responsible for formations 2 or 3 times that size, filled with draftees who had never held a rifle. Senior non-commissioned officers became the connective tissue of the entire enterprise, translating the Army's vision into something the newest private could actually absorb. The organizational charts looked orderly. The reality, in those first months, was considerably less so. New equipment began arriving at the division's installations, though rarely in the quantities or condition that optimists had promised. The Army was attempting to modernize itself across dozens of formations at the same time, drawing from an industrial base that had spent a decade in the grip of the Depression and was only now beginning to retool for military production. Trucks arrived without spare parts. Radios came without the manuals to operate them. Weapons that soldiers had read about in training manuals appeared in the flesh for the first time, requiring instruction from men who were themselves learning as they went. There was a quality to these early months that veterans would later describe as organized improvisation, everyone working urgently toward a goal that felt both important and perpetually out of reach. Fort Devens, in Massachusetts, became one of the central staging grounds for the division's expansion and training during this period. The installation had a history stretching back to the First World War, and in 1940 and 1941, it hummed with activity that it had not seen in decades. Soldiers drilled on its ranges and maneuvered across its training grounds in exercises that grew progressively more ambitious as months passed. The aim was not simply to teach individual skills, though those were essential, but to build the kind of unit cohesion that would allow men to function under the disorienting pressure of combat. That cohesion could not be manufactured quickly. It required shared hardship, shared failure, shared small victories. Devens provided the ground on which those experiences could be built. The exercises themselves grew in scale through 1940 and into 1941. The Army organized large maneuver series across the American South and in other regions, pitting divisions and corps against one another in simulated combat that sometimes covered hundreds of square miles. The 1st Division participated in these exercises alongside other formations, and the results were instructive in ways that planners had not entirely anticipated. Problems of coordination between infantry and armor became obvious in the field that had not been apparent on planning maps. Logistics. The movement of fuel, ammunition, rations, and medical supplies across extended distances proved more difficult than theoretical models suggested. Communications between units broke down at the worst possible moments, in exactly the way they might in actual combat. These failures were not setbacks. They were the curriculum. The division's officer corps during this period was a mixture of long-service regulars who had served through the lean interwar years and a growing cohort of newly commissioned men arriving from officer candidate schools and reserve officer training programs. The regulars carried institutional memory, an understanding of the division's identity, its standards, its expectations, that no training program could replicate quickly. They also, in some cases, carried habits of mind formed in an army that no longer existed, assumptions about the pace and character of combat that the war in Europe was already rendering obsolete. The newer officers brought energy and, often, intellectual flexibility. The friction between these two groups was at times productive, forcing conversations about doctrine and method that the division needed to have. Enlisted men arriving through the draft represented a cross-section of American life in ways that the old regular army had never been. They came from cities and farms, from the industrial Midwest and the rural South, from the coasts and the interior. Many had never traveled more than a day's drive from where they were born. The Army took these men and subjected them to a standardization process that was deliberate in its design. The same haircuts, the same uniforms, the same daily rhythms, the same chain of command. That standardization served a purpose beyond discipline. It was the beginning of the process by which individuals became something larger than themselves, by which a young man from a Pennsylvania mining town and another from a Louisiana bayou might come to trust each other with their lives. That trust was what the division was actually building. Weapons training accelerated through this period as the Army absorbed the lessons being transmitted from observers in Europe and from its own growing body of tactical analysis. The rifle remained the infantryman's fundamental tool, and marksmanship standards were enforced with a seriousness that reflected the understanding that individual accuracy mattered. But the division's soldiers were also learning to operate weapons that had not been part of the Army's culture during the interwar years. Crew served machine guns, mortars, anti-tank weapons whose effective use required coordination among multiple men rather than individual skill. Small unit tactics, the art of moving a squad or a platoon across contested ground while keeping casualties manageable, received attention that would pay dividends in ways that no one in the training fields of Massachusetts could yet fully appreciate. The division's senior leadership during this mobilization period worked to instill a culture of high standards while managing the reality that perfection was impossible, given the pace of expansion. Commanders at every level faced the challenge of maintaining the institutional identity of a formation that had existed for more than 2 decades while absorbing thousands of men who had no connection to that identity. The Big Red One's shoulder patch, that simple, bold numeral on a khaki field, was beginning to carry meaning for men who had only recently been civilians. The ceremonies and traditions through which military units maintain continuity served a function that went beyond sentiment. They connected the men of this new army to something that had proved itself in the mud of France, something that had a record and a reputation. That connection was a form of inheritance, and the division's experienced cadre worked to ensure the new men understood what they were inheriting. By the autumn of 1941, the 1st Division was a substantially different organization than it had been 18 months earlier. It was larger, better equipped, more practiced, and more conscious of its own identity as a formation built around a tradition of effective combat. The maneuvers and exercises had surfaced weaknesses that could be addressed, and many had been. There remained gaps in experience, in equipment, in the kind of tested confidence that only actual combat produces. But the division had moved from a hollow shell to something approaching a functional fighting force. The men who filed through the training fields and rifle ranges and field kitchens of Fort Devens and a dozen other installations could not have named what they were becoming. They were becoming soldiers of a kind the country had not produced in significant numbers since 1918. The world would shortly require them in numbers larger than anyone had yet publicly admitted. Then, on a Sunday morning in early December of 1941, the question of whether America would enter the war was answered for the nation by forces it had not chosen. The attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, brought a clarity that months of political debate had failed to produce. Within days, the United States was at war with Japan, and, following Germany's declaration, with the European Axis as well. For the 1st Infantry Division, the period of preparation was over. The training grounds, the maneuver areas, the long hours in the field, all of it had been building toward something real. That something was now arriving, faster than most had imagined, from a direction that still carried the power of surprise. The Big Red One was not yet the combat-tested formation it would become, but it was ready to begin the process of becoming one. Somewhere across the Atlantic, that process waited. In the autumn of 1942, the United States Army stood at a threshold. For nearly a year, America had been at war, yet no American division had fired a shot in anger against the Axis in any meaningful campaign. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, had trained in America with a hunger that only the untested could possess. They had drilled and exercised, learned the mechanics of amphibious assault, and waited. But waiting is not the business of soldiers who know combat is coming. In November of that year, the order came. The 1st Division would deploy to North Africa as the spearhead of Operation Torch, the first major American offensive against Nazi Germany and its allies. It was an audacious plan, born from American optimism and the grim necessity of opening a theater where American forces could finally engage the enemy. The division would sail across the Atlantic, landing near the port city of Oran on the northwestern coast of North Africa, a place that would mark their transition from theoretical warriors to combat soldiers. The embarkation began in late October, with thousands of men boarding transports and warships in Hampton Roads and other Atlantic ports. The voyage across the Atlantic was a study in improvisation and crowding. Men packed into holds and berthing spaces, seasick and uncomfortable, watching the convoy form and reform as it steamed eastward. There was no certainty of safe passage. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, and every officer knew the risks. But the convoy held together, escorted by destroyers and cruisers that prowled the periphery searching for submarines. The men occupied themselves with preparation, checking weapons, studying maps, reviewing the assault plan. Officers moved among them, checking morale and readiness. The voyage took nearly 2 weeks, and as the North African coast drew closer, tension mounted. They were sailing toward an operation that had never been attempted by American forces in this scale and complexity. There was genuine uncertainty about how they would be received. The Vichy French controlled North Africa under the terms of the armistice that had ended the fighting in France in 1940. This created a peculiar and unstable situation. The French government at Vichy collaborated with Nazi Germany, yet the French military in North Africa remained partially independent and fiercely proud. Nobody knew with certainty whether French forces would resist or surrender, whether they would fight the Americans or accept their arrival. This uncertainty hung over the entire operation. The American command had attempted some negotiation with French officers, but the diplomatic channels were murky and unreliable. When the American fleet appeared off the coast near Oran, the decision of the French became a matter of hours rather than weeks. The landings themselves occurred on the 8th of November, 1942, at dawn. The 1st Division, under the command of Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, hit the beaches at several points near Oran. Allen was a dynamic and aggressive commander, a career officer who carried the reputation of being tough and uncompromising. He had never seen combat himself, but he had studied military history with the obsession of a man determined not to repeat the mistakes of others. The amphibious assault was clumsy by later standards, but effective. The men waded ashore from landing craft, laden with ammunition and equipment, meeting scattered resistance from French forces who had been ordered to defend their positions. There was confusion on the beaches, as is almost always the case in amphibious operations. But the 1st Division pressed inland with the momentum that would become their hallmark. The fighting against Vichy French forces was strange and bitter in its own way. These were not Nazis, but they were ordered to resist American forces, and many of them obeyed those orders. There were casualties on both sides, American soldiers and French soldiers killing each other in the cause of a political arrangement that neither of them had made. Aircraft strafed the beaches. Small arms fire cracked from defensive positions, yet within hours the outcome was clear. The sheer weight of American firepower and the momentum of the assault broke French resistance. Officers in the French chain of command recognized that further resistance was futile. By the evening of the 8th of November, most French units in the area had ceased fighting, and many had simply dissolved into confusion or agreed to cease fire arrangements with advancing American units. Major General Allen moved quickly to consolidate the beachhead and push inland. The 1st Division's organizational structure was relatively new, modified from the old square division format to the more efficient triangular organization. This meant it was smaller and more mobile than its predecessors, with better communications and flexibility. Allen used this to advantage, pushing motorized columns inland toward Oran itself, seeking to cut off the city and prevent any organized French withdrawal or reinforcement. The weather was favorable, the terrain relatively open, and the 1st Division moved with the speed that would become their signature throughout the war. Supply lines were precarious, stretched thin over recently conquered ground, but Allen pushed forward anyway. He understood that in the opening phase of an operation, momentum mattered more than perfect supply. He pushed his men hard, drove them toward objectives, demanded speed and aggression from his officers. By the 10th of November, just 2 days after the initial landings, American forces had secured Oran and consolidated control of the immediate area around the city. It had been a notably swift operation, accomplished with far fewer casualties than anyone had dared hope. The men of the 1st Division had proven that they could execute an amphibious assault, establish a beachhead, fight a mobile campaign, and achieve their objectives in a matter of days. It was their first taste of combat victory, and it had the effect that such victories always have on troops. Confidence surged through the division. The men who had trained for so long finally understood that they had been trained well. Their officers, including Allen, had proven capable of commanding men in battle. The logistics of the operation, clumsy as they were, had somehow managed to get supplies ashore and pushed inland to where they were needed. The 1st Division had crossed the threshold from training to combat, and they had done so successfully. Yet this success, gratifying as it was, obscured deeper realities that would unfold over the coming weeks and months. The Vichy French had resisted only lightly, and in many cases had surrendered or simply melted away rather than fight in earnest. They were defending political positions, not fighting for their survival. Ahead of the 1st Division, waiting in Tunisia, were German and Italian forces who would fight with very different intensity and purpose. The division had defeated Vichy French troops, which was necessary for the operation, but not a true test of their capabilities against the Wehrmacht. The men did not yet understand this distinction. They felt the intoxication of victory, the relief of having finally encountered the enemy, and prevailed. Allen fed this confidence, pushing his men to seize Oran, to secure ports, to establish airfields from which American air power could operate across North Africa. In the days following the initial assault, the 1st Division transitioned from an assault formation to an occupying force and garrison unit. The beaches and the area immediately inland became a sprawling American military encampment. Supply dumps grew larger. More ships arrived, offloading vehicles, ammunition, food, and equipment. Engineering units worked to repair and expand the port facilities at Oran, bringing them back into operation after years of minimal use. Medical facilities were established. Signal troops strung telephone and radio lines across the newly conquered territory. The administrative machinery of military occupation began to function. Officers had to deal with the displaced French population, establish order in Oran, and begin the process of organizing the newly captured territory into a functioning base for further operations. It was not the romantic vision of warfare that soldiers sometimes carry, but it was essential work. The broader strategic picture of North Africa was becoming clearer in November and early December of 1942. The American landings near Oran and Casablanca, combined with British landings further east near Algiers, had established a strong Allied presence in French North Africa, but the Germans and Italians still controlled the territory further east, in Tunisia. They began an immediate buildup, flying in reinforcements and equipment, trying to establish a defensive line that would prevent the Allies from driving them out of North Africa entirely. The race was on to see whether the Allies could advance eastward quickly enough to catch the Axis forces while they were still relatively weak, or whether the Germans would have time to establish a solid defense. The 1st Division would play a central role in this race. Allen was eager to push forward, to pursue the retreating Vichy forces and begin contact with German units. But logistics, geography, and command authority slowed the pace. The 1st Division had to consolidate its position, gather supplies, and prepare for a longer campaign than the swift assault on Oran had suggested. By the end of November, the operational tempo was accelerating. Reconnaissance elements and advance guards from the 1st Division were ranging inland and eastward, probing toward the Tunisian border and seeking contact with German forces. The men were beginning to understand that they had entered into something far larger than the assault on Oran. Ahead of them lay an entire campaign, potentially a prolonged struggle in an unfamiliar environment against a disciplined and dangerous enemy. Some of the initial euphoria of victory began to temper into something more realistic. Officers like Allen drove the division forward, pushing patrols out ahead, establishing supply lines, and preparing for the next phase of operations. The 1st Division had arrived in North Africa as an untested formation. Within a matter of weeks, they had landed on a hostile shore, fought their first battle, secured territory, and begun the transition to sustained campaigning. They had proven that they could function as a combat division. What remained to be seen was whether they could sustain that performance, adapt their tactics against a truly formidable enemy, and endure the grinding demands of a prolonged campaign that would test them in ways that even their difficult training had not. Operation Torch was, from the American perspective, a triumph. The division had achieved its immediate objectives with relatively modest casualties. The landings had succeeded. The beachhead had been established and expanded. The city of Oran had fallen into American hands. The strategic objective of establishing a North African foothold had been accomplished. Yet from the vantage point of the men in the 1st Division, standing on the dusty terrain of North Africa in November of 1942, the significance of this moment was still unfolding. They did not yet know that they were about to enter into the longest and most brutal campaign that any American division would fight during the entire war. They did not yet understand that North Africa would transform them from soldiers into combat veterans, that it would teach them lessons in tactics and survival that would define their service through Europe and beyond. They only knew that they had been given their opportunity, that they had crossed the threshold into real war, and that whatever came next would demand everything they possessed. The Big Red One had arrived in Africa. The long struggle for mastery of the continent and the emergence of the 1st Division as one of the finest combat formations America had ever fielded was just beginning. The North African campaign opened with promise, but delivered humiliation. The 1st Division had arrived in theater expecting to face colonial troops and hastily assembled Italian units, the remnants of Mussolini's faltering army. What they encountered instead was the Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel, a command schooled in mobile desert warfare and equipped with tanks the Americans had never seen in combat. The division's officers, trained in the slower warfare of the previous world conflict, found themselves operating against an enemy who measured distances in kilometers of sand and victory in the swift exploitation of terrain. The green American formations would learn hard lessons in Tunisia, lessons written in blood, and retreat before the long climb toward competence began. In the opening months of 1943, the 1st Division was scattered across North Africa, its units dispersed, and operating under confusing command arrangements. The division itself was split, with elements supporting different core objectives in different sectors of the front. The men were still learning how to keep equipment functioning in the grinding sand and heat, still adjusting to the rhythms of a theater, where water was rationed and the enemy could appear from any direction across the flat expanse of the desert. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen commanded the division with aggressiveness and tactical flexibility, qualities that would later prove vital but that sometimes outpaced the division's actual capability to execute complex operations. The soldiers themselves were largely drafted men, many serving far from home for the first time, without the hardened confidence that comes from shared combat experience. Their training in America had been rushed, compressed into months, rather than the years that had shaped the professional armies arrayed against them. The battle for the town of Gafsa in central Tunisia began in mid-March 1943 and became the 1st Division's first sustained engagement against a coordinated enemy force. Gafsa itself held little tactical value, but it represented a test of whether American infantry could maneuver, concentrate force, and drive an enemy from prepared positions. The division's assault on the town proceeded methodically, with artillery preparation followed by infantry advances through terrain that offered little cover and nowhere to hide from machine gun fire. The engagement lasted several days, and while the Americans eventually prevailed, the victory came with casualties that seemed disproportionate to the modest objective. The men discovered that the German and Italian defenders, even when vastly outnumbered, would not retreat until they had extracted maximum cost in American dead and wounded. Speed and aggressive tactics, which had been emphasized in training, often resulted in units being pinned down by smaller enemy groups armed with effective anti-tank guns and well-positioned machine guns. What lay ahead was far more devastating. In late February 1943, even as some American units were moving toward Gafsa, Rommel launched a counteroffensive against the green American formations further north, in the region around Kasserine Pass. The 1st Division had not yet been fully committed to that sector, but the shock wave of that German attack rippled across the entire theater. American units were ambushed and surrounded. Some surrendered in large numbers, and the myth of German invincibility in the desert seemed confirmed by the speed and precision of the Wehrmacht's response. The 1st Division watched and learned as other American divisions suffered tactically. When elements of the 1st did move northward to reinforce the collapsing sector, they were inserting themselves into a battlefield where confusion reigned, and the Germans held the initiative. The lessons came quickly and brutally. American armor needed better coordination with infantry. American anti-tank defenses had to be positioned more carefully. American commanders needed to understand how to defend against German infiltration tactics that exploited poor visibility and stretched defensive lines. The 1st Division's engagement at Kasserine Pass itself was limited but consequential. The division arrived not as the main force, but as reinforcement, as part of the effort to prevent a complete American collapse. Companies and battalions found themselves in firefights with German reconnaissance elements and panzer units that moved with terrifying speed across the open terrain. The American soldiers discovered that German tanks mounted superior firepower and that German infantry moved in coordinated fashion, maximizing suppressing fire, while assault groups maneuvered to enfilade American positions. Radio communication across the division's scattered units was often unreliable, meaning that coordinated response to German maneuvers was slow and sometimes confused. Officers and non-commissioned officers who had trained in peacetime now had to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between holding ground and being overrun. The surviving soldiers who retreated from Kasserine did not flee in panic, but they retreated, and that fact marked a psychological turning point that no amount of official rhetoric could erase. The weeks following Kasserine brought organizational and tactical changes. The 1st Division was reorganized under new command structures, with closer coordination between armor, artillery, and infantry. Training exercises emphasized combined arms operations, with tank support being coordinated more carefully with infantry attacks, and with anti-tank defenses being positioned to cover probable German penetration routes. Artillery officers and enlisted men worked to improve the speed and accuracy of fire support, understanding that in the face of superior German armor, the Americans would rely heavily on concentrated artillery to break up attacks and support advances. The division's leadership studied German tactics obsessively, trying to understand the patterns that had proven so effective at Kasserine. Veteran German and Italian soldiers taken prisoner were interrogated, and their testimony filled intelligence reports that were distributed throughout the division. The soldiers themselves, having seen German tanks and German infantry tactics firsthand, became more serious in their training, less inclined to view the war as an adventure and more conscious of how quickly carelessness could be fatal. The 1st Division's next major engagement came in March and April 1943, as the division advanced again in southern Tunisia toward the Central Heights and the town of Gabes. By this point, the organization was beginning to function more smoothly. The men had gained confidence through small successes, and the leadership had begun to internalize lessons about how to fight the German army effectively. Units advanced more carefully, with reconnaissance preceding main assaults, and with better coordination between armor and infantry. The Germans and Italians, recognizing that the American forces were becoming stronger, and that supplies from Sicily were beginning to strengthen the entire front, began a strategic withdrawal northward toward the final defenses around Tunis. The 1st Division pursued this retreating enemy, but without the hasty aggression that had led to casualties at Gafsa and without the overconfidence that had left units vulnerable at Kasserine. Instead, the division's advance was methodical, with each ridge and defended village being approached as a serious tactical problem, rather than an obstacle to be smashed through. By late April 1943, the 1st Division had pushed deep into northern Tunisia and was positioned on the ridgelines and broken terrain overlooking the approaches to Tunis and Bizerta. The enemy was contracting, being squeezed between converging American, British, and French forces. German and Italian units fought stubbornly for every hill and defensive position, as if maintaining honor in retreat somehow measured the success or failure of the entire North African campaign. The 1st Division's soldiers, now hardened by months of combat, handled these final engagements with a competence that would have been unimaginable at Gafsa or Kasserine. Officers and men understood how to mass firepower, how to use terrain, how to coordinate movement so that no single unit was exposed to devastating flank fire. The casualty rates, while still significant, were becoming more proportionate to the objectives being achieved. The division was not yet the instrument of war that it would become by 1944, but it was no longer stumbling through combat as an amateur force. The final German and Italian surrender in North Africa came in May 1943, and the 1st Division could count the hard statistics of its learning curve. Hundreds of men had been killed in the Tunisia campaign, many more wounded, and still others suffering from dysentery, malaria, or the cumulative exhaustion of desert warfare. The division had lost men and equipment that could not easily be replaced, and it had expended ammunition and fuel in quantities that had stretched the supply lines. Yet the division had gained something more valuable than the relatively modest geographic prizes of Tunisia. It had gained experience, a shared understanding of how the enemy fought, and a collective knowledge about how American infantry and armor could be combined to defeat that enemy. The veterans of Gafsa and Kasserine became the backbone of the division's leadership in the campaigns that followed, men who understood at visceral levels the costs of hesitation and the dangers of overconfidence. The North African campaign had been incomplete as a military victory. The Axis forces had been driven from the theater, but the campaign had required months of fighting that many American planners had expected to conclude far more swiftly. The 1st Division's role in that extended struggle had transformed it from a freshly arrived formation into something approximating a field army. Officers learned that American soldiers, given proper training and leadership, could fight effectively against the German army. The enlisted men learned that survival often depended on small details, on how well ammunition was distributed, on how quickly a squad leader could assess terrain and position his men to maximum advantage. The division's artillery became more reliable, its armor coordination more practiced, its support elements more efficient. These incremental improvements would compound through the months and years of the war, until by 1944, the 1st Division would be recognized as one of the finest combat formations the American Army could deploy. The broader significance of Tunisia extended beyond the 1st Division. The North African campaign demonstrated to American commanders and to the American public that the German army could be fought and defeated, that the legend of invincibility had been oversold, and that sustained effort and proper organization could overcome initial setbacks. The 1st Division's experience in that theater would inform doctrine and tactics throughout the American Army for the remainder of the war. The soldiers and officers who survived Tunisia would carry those lessons to Italy and France and Germany, teaching younger replacements by example and by explicit instruction how wars were actually fought against a professional and capable enemy. The campaign had cost the 1st Division dearly in blood, but it had purchased something irreplaceable, the confidence that came from having faced the worst the enemy could offer and having endured. By the summer of 1943, the 1st Division could look back on Tunisia with a mixture of hard-won pride and lingering pain. The beachheads of North Africa had been secured, not by overwhelming force, but by learning to fight more effectively than at the beginning of the campaign. Gafsa had taught small unit tactics and the importance of reconnaissance. Kasserine had taught the bitter lesson that superior firepower and maneuver could devastate unprepared formations, but also that such defeats need not be final if leadership remained sound and the will to continue fighting remained unbroken. The subsequent campaigns in Tunisia had taught the practical lessons of coordinated operations, the integration of armor with infantry, and the patience required to push back an enemy that was always dangerous regardless of strategic circumstances. The 1st Division had paid a terrible price for these lessons, but having paid it, they would not be forgotten. The division was now tempered, focused, and prepared for the campaigns ahead. North Africa had been the furnace, and the big red one had emerged from it as hardened steel. By the summer of 1943, the 1st Infantry Division had learned the language of modern warfare in ways that textbooks could never teach. The campaigns in North Africa and Tunisia had cost them hundreds of men, exposed tactical weaknesses, and forced a reckoning with the reality that American soldiers, no matter how brave or determined, were not automatically superior to their enemies. But that education had also transformed them. When orders came down in May for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, the big red one understood what awaited them in a way the wide-eyed recruits of 2 years earlier could never have imagined. They would be among the first Allied soldiers to set foot on European soil in this war. The eyes of the world and the reputation of American fighting power would turn toward them as they approached a hostile shore. Sicily lay across the Mediterranean Sea from North Africa, separated from the Italian mainland by a narrow strait. The operation itself was vast in scope. Nearly 500,000 troops from American, British, and Canadian forces would participate, transported by over 2,500 ships and landing craft. The 1st Division, now under the command of Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, would strike the beaches near Licata on the southern coast on the 10th of July 1943. Allen was a figure of controversy within the Army. Some saw in him a brilliant, aggressive commander, capable of extracting maximum combat effectiveness from his men. Others viewed him as reckless, a glory seeker, more interested in his division's reputation than in sound military judgment. What no one disputed was his energy and his absolute commitment to making the 1st Division the cutting edge of American military power. Under Allen, the division trained relentlessly through June, rehearsing assault landings, studying maps of the Sicilian terrain, and preparing for what everyone knew would be a perilous enterprise. The night before the landing was tense with the peculiar electricity that precedes combat. Men lay on the decks of transport ships, smoking cigarettes that glowed like small warnings in the darkness, writing letters to mothers and wives they might never see again, checking weapons they had already checked a dozen times. Some prayed. Others spoke in low voices about home, about normal things, baseball games and girls and the taste of real beer instead of the thin coffee they had become accustomed to. Officers moved among them, offering what encouragement they could, though everyone understood that words meant little when measured against the reality of what awaited. The Navy had provided close air support, and naval gunfire would assist the landing, but once the soldiers hit the beach, they would be largely on their own, depending on training, courage, and luck to survive the first terrible minutes when German and Italian defenders would pour fire down on them from prepared positions above the sand. The assault began before dawn on the 10th of July. The sky was dark, the sea surprisingly calm, and as the landing craft pitched toward shore, the soldiers of the 1st Division could see flashes on the horizon where American bombers had been striking enemy positions. The preliminary bombardment had torn gaps in the Italian defenses, but it had also alerted them to what was coming. As the ramps dropped and men waded ashore, the beach erupted with machine gun and rifle fire. Unlike Omaha Beach, which would become famous for its horror only a year later, the resistance at Licata was fierce, but not overwhelming. The Italian troops defending Sicily were, in many cases, conscripts with limited motivation. Some fought hard, others, demoralized by months of bombing and aware that their nation's fascist government was crumbling, offered only token resistance before surrendering. The 1st Division established a foothold within the first hours, though not without cost. Men fell on the sand, cried out for medics, and their comrades pressed forward, stepping over bodies to reach the lee of the beach, where they could return fire and begin to organize assault formations. The real test came inland. The terrain of Sicily was different from North Africa, rougher, more broken, with stone walls and terraces that favored defenders. German troops, unlike the Italian conscripts, fought with discipline and skill, conducting measured withdrawals rather than standing to be slaughtered. The 1st Division found itself engaged in a grinding campaign of advance and consolidation, taking small towns, clearing valleys, pursuing an enemy who refused to break but who also could not stop the American advance. The infantry learned to move carefully through this landscape, to scout before committing themselves, to call for artillery support rather than attack prepared positions frontally. The lessons from Tunisia were evident now. Fewer hasty attacks, more deliberate operations, greater reliance on fire support rather than pure audacity. Progress was measured in kilometers captured and held, not in dramatic breakthroughs, but it was steady progress nonetheless. Command of the division began to shift during the Sicily campaign. Major General Clarence Hübner, a methodical and careful officer with a reputation for tactical soundness, began assuming greater responsibility within the 1st Division's operations. The relationship between Allen and Hübner became increasingly complex. Allen remained nominally in command, but he was also preparing for reassignment to higher duties, and the transition of leadership was beginning. Hübner represented a different style of generalship than Allen, less flamboyant, more cautious in his use of resources, deeply concerned with the welfare of his soldiers. Both men were dedicated to victory, but their approaches differed in ways that would become more apparent in the months ahead. For now, as the division fought its way across Sicily, both commanders worked to drive German and Italian forces back and to expand the American beachhead. The fighting lasted through the middle of July and into August. The 7th Army, of which the 1st Division was a part under the overall command of General George Patton, swept across Sicily in a campaign that lasted only 38 days. The British forces under General Bernard Montgomery moved more slowly on the eastern side of the island, as their approach was constrained by German defensive positions and by the geography of the terrain. American forces moved faster, their mobility allowing them to bypass strongpoints and maintain pressure on retreating Axis forces. The 1st Division played a crucial role in this rapid advance, their combat experience from North Africa making them reliable and effective. They knew how to fight now, not just how to march and fire on command. They understood terrain, how to use it, how to position machine guns and mortar concentrations to break up enemy counterattacks. They had learned that war was not about individual acts of heroism, but about the coordinated application of firepower and the ability to maintain momentum. By the first week of August, the campaign was effectively over. German forces withdrew across the Strait of Messina, back to mainland Italy, and American forces occupied the western and central portions of Sicily. The division consolidated their positions, treated their wounded, and buried their dead. Casualty figures for the 1st Division in Sicily were moderate compared to what they would face in Europe, but every man killed represented a loss that could not be replaced. a potential officer lost, a veteran experience gone. The soldiers cleaned their weapons, wrote letters home, and tried to rest. For many of them, this would be the last relatively quiet period they would enjoy for nearly 2 years. They did not know it yet, but the next few months would bring them to Normandy, to the bloodiest beaches of the entire war, and to campaigns across France and Germany that would consume the strength of the army in ways that Sicily, for all its violence, had only foreshadowed. What emerged from the Sicilian campaign was a new confidence, not the cocky confidence of soldiers who had not yet faced real combat, but the measured confidence of men who had been tested and had not broken. The 1st Division had proven that American soldiers could assault prepared positions, could fight in unfamiliar terrain against experienced enemies, and could accomplish military objectives. General Patton recognized this. He made a point of visiting the division, of acknowledging their performance, of making clear to the Army and to the world that this unit was something special. The press, always eager for heroes and stories of American success, began to focus attention on the 1st Infantry Division. Newspapers back home reported on their exploits. The men themselves, exhausted as they were, took pride in knowing that they were being recognized as one of the Army's most effective fighting formations. The Big Red One, their distinctive shoulder patch marking them to everyone who saw them, was becoming legendary. The transition from Sicily set in motion events that would define the next phase of the war. The invasion of mainland Italy was planned for early September, and the 1st Division would be among the assault forces. Across the Strait of Messina, German troops were preparing defensive positions, and Italian forces were in chaos as their government began negotiations with the Allies. The men of the 1st Division did not have much time to rest. Ships were being prepared, landing craft were being loaded with ammunition and supplies, and plans were being drawn up for an operation that would dwarf Sicily in scope and violence. Italy was the first step. Once the Allies secured Italy, the next step would be France, and with it would come operations on a scale that would make even Sicily seem almost like a training exercise. In the last days of August, as summer turned toward autumn, the soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division looked across the water toward mainland Italy. Some of them could see the shore, a distant line of cliffs and beach that represented the next chapter in their war. They had proven themselves in Tunisia. They had established themselves as effective combat soldiers in Sicily. Now they would be called upon to do it again, and again, and again, until either they were killed, wounded so severely they could no longer fight, or the war itself came to an end. The division had entered the war in North Africa as an untested force. It was leaving Sicily as a proven, reliable, battle-hardened unit. The growth had been paid for in blood, but the investment had been repaid in capability and reputation. The 1st Division was ready for whatever came next, though in their most honest moments, the soldiers understood that what came next would demand everything they had to give. The invasion of Sicily had proven that the 1st Division could fight. Now came the test of whether they could endure. In September 1943, barely 2 months after storming the beaches near Gela, the division prepared for its next crossing. This time the target was not an island, but the Italian mainland itself. The strait between Sicily and Calabria was narrow, just a few kilometers of water, yet it represented a threshold. On the far shore waited an enemy who had retreated, but not been defeated. The Germans had already begun their withdrawal northward, and they would not give up the peninsula without a fight. For the 1st Division, Italy would become something different from Sicily. Not a sprint across an island, but a grinding march up terrain that seemed designed by nature to favor the defender. The crossing came on the 3rd of September, 1943. The division's assault troops climbed into landing craft and pushed across the strait under cover of artillery and air support. The beach near Reggio di Calabria offered less resistance than Sicily had. German defenders were already pulling back toward prepared positions further north, but as the 1st Division consolidated its beachhead and began to push inland, the nature of the campaign became clear. The Italian peninsula was a spine of mountains running north and south, with only narrow coastal plains and river valleys. Every kilometer northward meant climbing higher, fighting through more difficult terrain, and becoming further from supply lines that were themselves struggling to keep pace with the advance. The enemy would choose where to stand and fight, and they would choose ground that multiplied their strength. Within days, the division crossed the Crati River and pushed toward Salerno. What should have been a rapid link-up with American and British forces landing at Salerno became instead a race against time and German reaction. The German command had begun to recover from the shock of invasion. They rushed reinforcements southward, determined to either crush the beachhead at Salerno or at least delay the American advance long enough to establish a strong defensive line. The 1st Division became part of that race, moving northward with increasing urgency. The roads deteriorated as the division climbed into the foothills of the Apennines. Dust choked the columns moving north. The heat of the southern Italian summer pressed down on troops who were working without rest, pushing forward with the knowledge that if they delayed too long, their comrades at Salerno might be pushed back into the sea. It was in these first weeks that the division learned a new rhythm of war, not the sharp crisis of amphibious assault, but the wearing exhaustion of continuous pursuit against an enemy who was always just ahead and always ready to turn and fight. The Salerno beachhead was in fact under terrible pressure. The Germans had nearly succeeded in driving a wedge between the American Fifth Army and the British Eighth Army. For days, the situation hung in balance. The 1st Division's arrival on the beachhead's southern shoulder helped tip the scales, but only barely. The price was measured in casualties and exhaustion. Young soldiers who had celebrated their victory in Sicily just weeks earlier now found themselves facing a different kind of warfare. They were no longer raiders or invaders of an island. They were becoming part of a grinding campaign that would measure progress not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in kilometers gained and defensive positions taken at terrible cost. The division dug in around Salerno, holding the line while supply ships unloaded critical cargo and reinforcements poured ashore. For the first time, many soldiers of the Big Red One understood that victory in this war would not come quickly. As September turned to October, the division began its next major operation, the crossing of the Volturno River. The river barred the way north, and the Germans had organized a strong defensive position along its banks. They held the high ground on the far shore, and they had prepared positions that covered every approach. The 1st Division's assault crossing in October 1943 became a brutal affair. Engineers laid pontoons and assault craft pushed into the current under heavy fire. The division suffered significant casualties in the crossing and in the fighting to expand the beachhead on the far shore. But they crossed. This became the pattern of the Italian campaign: rivers to cross, mountains to climb, Germans who fought stubbornly and then withdrew to the next position. Each tactical victory led not to breakthrough, but to the next prepared defense, the next river obstacle, the next mountain stronghold. The fighting became a contest between the division's will to advance and the terrain's resistance to being traversed. Trucks and jeeps could only travel the few roads that existed, and those roads were exposed to German artillery and air attack. Infantry had to move on foot through mountains that offered no cover and every vantage to an enemy perched on the higher ground. The casualties mounted steadily. Unlike the sharp, sudden losses of a beach landing, these were losses that accumulated day after day, week after week. A soldier shot by a sniper, a small unit ambush, shellfire that found a column moving along a mountain pass. The division's medical officers and rear echelon worked constantly to evacuate wounded, patch them up, and sometimes send them back to the line if their wounds permitted. Hospital trains and ships moved constantly between Italy and North Africa and eventually back toward the United States, carrying soldiers whose bodies and minds bore the marks of continuous combat. By November 1943, the division had reached the area around Monte Cassino. Here the campaign took on new dimensions. The mountain itself stood roughly 1,400 meters high, and it dominated the approaches to the Liri Valley and the road north to Rome. The Germans had recognized its value immediately. They fortified it and garrisoned it, and they built defensive positions in the surrounding mountains. The 1st Division did not attack the monastery itself, but they fought in the mountains and valleys around it, engaging in some of the most bitter fighting of the Italian campaign. The bocage of Sicily seemed almost gentle in memory compared to these mountains. The mountains channeled movement, made supply difficult, and offered perfect positions for defense. The 1st Division would spend weeks in this area, gaining ground slowly and at considerable cost. The casualty lists grew longer as the months passed. Some units of the 1st Division had been in continuous combat since North Africa, nearly a year earlier. Officers and sergeants who had led their men through Tunisia, Sicily, and now Italy had aged in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar. They had learned war through hard experience, but that learning came with a burden. They carried the names and faces of men who had not come back. Junior enlisted men who had survived the landing at Gafsa or the beach at Gela now found themselves in leadership positions, commanding fire teams and squads, making decisions about which direction to move, whether to advance or hold position. The cohesion of the division rested on these non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and corporals whose experience had become the foundation of unit effectiveness. By the end of 1943, the 1st Division had moved north of the Monte Cassino area and was preparing for winter operations. The mountains grew more snow-covered as the division climbed higher. Supply became even more difficult. The roads were slick, and trucks carrying ammunition, food, and fuel struggled through the passes. The division's artillery batteries had to be positioned carefully to support the infantry, while remaining accessible for resupply. The Germans had not been beaten down the peninsula. They had been pushed back, but they remained organized, remained dangerous, and remained determined to defend German-held territory. The 1st Division had learned that defeating an enemy who did not want to be defeated required more than tactical skill or courage. It required sustained commitment, the willingness to absorb casualties and keep moving forward, and the strategic understanding that this war would be won not through brilliant maneuvers, but through the grinding application of superior resources and determination. The Italian campaign had transformed the 1st Division. The men who had gone ashore in North Africa the previous November were now veterans. They understood modern warfare in ways that no training exercise could teach. They had seen how quickly plans collapsed under fire, how terrain could be as deadly as any bullet, how the weather and supply lines were as important to victory as the skill of individual soldiers. The division had also learned the cost of victory. Every kilometer north along the Italian peninsula had been purchased with blood. The hospitals overflowed with wounded. The casualty replacement system struggled to keep units up to strength. Yet the division remained combat effective. This too was part of what war demanded, the ability to absorb losses and continue the mission. By early 1944, as the 1st Division prepared for its next major operation, there was no question that it had become one of the most experienced divisions in the American Army. The officers and men of the Big Red One had learned their craft through the hardest school possible. They had learned it in Tunisia against the Germans, in Sicily against scattered defenders, and now in Italy against an enemy who understood defensive warfare. That experience would be crucial in what came next. The invasion of the European continent was coming, and the 1st Division would play a central role. But before that ultimate test, they had spent a year learning that winning battles was one thing, and winning wars was another. Italy had taught them that warfare was not about dramatic moments, but about sustained effort, about moving forward when exhausted, about maintaining cohesion and purpose when everything conspired to break both. These lessons would define the division's performance in everything that followed. Chapter 11, Normandy. Before dawn on the 6th of June, 1944, the waters of the English Channel churned with the largest invasion fleet ever assembled. More than 5,000 ships and landing craft carried nearly 2 million soldiers across those cold, contested waters. The 1st Infantry Division, now hardened by North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, stood ready once again. These men had learned the brutal calculus of modern warfare. They had survived previous assaults and earned the unshakable reputation that came with survival. Now they would face their greatest trial. The objective was a stretch of French coastline code-named Omaha Beach, and it would demand everything they possessed. For many of the soldiers standing on those heaving decks, watching the darkness give way to the pale light of dawn, this would be the moment that defined not only their war, but their entire lives. The division had trained relentlessly for this assault, studying aerial photographs and models of the beach defenses, practicing amphibious landings on the coasts of southern England. They understood that the German fortifications at Omaha were among the most formidable in all of Normandy. Concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire dominated the shoreline. Anti-tank guns and machine gun emplacements waited in fortified positions. Barbed wire, mines, and obstacles meant to rip open the hulls of landing craft studded the beach and the shallow water beyond. Intelligence had identified the 72nd German Infantry Division as the primary defender, supplemented by other units dug in along the bluffs that rose sharply from the sand. The 1st Division would form only a portion of the assault force at Omaha, but their performance would be critical to the entire operation. The weight of expectation pressed upon every officer and man. They knew this was not Sicily or Italy. This was the invasion of Fortress Europe, and the Germans would fight with the desperation of a nation facing invasion on its home continent. The Navy destroyers and cruisers opened fire on the German positions in the pre-dawn darkness, their guns illuminating the sky with brief, violent flashes. The noise was almost beyond human comprehension, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very air. Thousands of tons of shells rained down on Omaha, on the bluffs and bunkers and gun emplacements. Surely, the soldiers thought, nothing could survive such bombardment. The confidence that gripped the assault force was almost tangible. As the light grew stronger, wave after wave of landing craft began their run toward the shore. The 1st Division men huddled in those vulnerable vessels, rifles gripped tight, seasickness overwhelming many despite the cold fear coursing through their veins. They had seen combat before, but this was different. The scale was incomprehensible. The noise never stopped. The air itself seemed hostile, filled with the screams of engines and the roar of naval gunfire and the whine of aircraft overhead. But the Germans had not been destroyed. The bombardment, for all its terrible weight, had failed to eliminate the core of the enemy defense. The bunkers and fortifications had been built with precisely this assault in mind, hardened against exactly the kind of preparation fire that had just rained down. When the first landing craft touched the sand and dropped their ramps, the men who stumbled out into the shallow water found themselves not walking onto a conquered beach, but rather stepping into a carefully prepared slaughterhouse. Machine gun fire erupted from a dozen locations, catching the soldiers in the open with nowhere to hide. Mortar rounds began falling, spraying shrapnel across the beach. Anti-tank fire smashed through landing craft, turning them into burning hulks and drowning those trapped inside. The beach became a nightmare world of smoke and blood and chaos. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Some were hit in the initial surge from the water. Others were cut down as they tried to advance across the sand toward whatever cover might exist. The casualties mounted with horrifying speed, and the assault had barely begun. The 1st Division soldiers who survived those first moments ashore found themselves pinned on a beach that offered almost no protection. The tide was coming in, and corpses and wreckage were beginning to accumulate in the water. Men pressed themselves flat against the sand, returning fire at enemies they could barely see. Officers tried to organize resistance and push forward, but the volume of fire pouring down from the bluffs seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. Some units found slight depressions or concrete obstacles that offered minimal shelter. Soldiers clustered together, trying to suppress the enemy guns well enough to move forward. The smoke from the bombardment and naval gunfire, which had seemed like such an advantage, began to dissipate, leaving the beach exposed and naked before the German guns. Reinforcements continued to arrive, each wave of landing craft disgorging fresh soldiers into the hellscape of Omaha. These replacements found a beach already crowded with wounded and dead, and they too came under fire almost immediately. The beach became so congested that movement was nearly impossible, and the mounting casualties created a crisis of command and control. For hours, the assault seemed to hang on the edge of catastrophic failure. The engineers who had been tasked with clearing obstacles to allow follow-on waves to land found themselves pinned and unable to complete their mission. The specialized equipment meant to breach the fortifications was destroyed or abandoned. The carefully planned schedule of assault waves began to break down as units lost cohesion and commanders struggled to maintain any sort of organization. German reinforcements, though delayed by interdiction from American air and naval forces, continued to arrive and counterattack. The weight of the defense seemed immovable, an unbreakable wall of fire and steel. Yet the soldiers of the 1st Division, along with those from the 29th Division and other units, refused to be pushed back into the sea. Small groups of men, led by junior officers and non-commissioned officers, began to find ways forward. They discovered or created gaps in the wire. They located and suppressed specific machine gun nests through sheer determination and firepower. They moved up the beach in rushes, a few meters at a time, accepting casualties as the inevitable cost of progress. The division's training, its experience, and the courage of its soldiers began to turn the tide. By midday, the breakneck assault began to gain ground. Elements of the 1st Division, working in concert with engineer units and other forces, managed to establish several footholds at the base of the bluffs. The assault waves continued to land, and gradually, the Americans achieved a kind of local superiority. Soldiers used explosives, flamethrowers, and grenades to root out German defenders from their fortifications. The fighting became close and brutal, often hand-to-hand. The bluffs began to fall, one by one, as the Americans pushed upward against desperate resistance. By late afternoon, the 1st Division had secured enough of Omaha Beach that the immediate crisis had passed. The beachhead, though tenuous and costly beyond measure, had been established. The division had suffered grievously. More than 2,000 men from the 1st Division alone had been killed, wounded, or captured on that single day. Many units had taken casualty rates exceeding 50%. The beach itself was littered with the detritus of battle, with bodies and wreckage and abandoned equipment, a proof of the ferocity of the fighting. They chose to hold and reorganize rather than commit to an immediate assault. It was a critical error. The 1st Division, under the steady command of Major General Clarence Hübner, who had recently assumed control of the division, drove deeper into Normandy. The soldiers who had survived the beach, exhausted, shocked by what they had witnessed, many of them traumatized by the scale of the casualties, nevertheless moved forward. They fought through bocage, the dense hedgerow country that made every meter a struggle. They cleared villages where German snipers made each street a dangerous passage. They established contact with other American units and began to expand the beachhead. The division that had entered the water at dawn as an assault force emerged from the fighting as a fully committed army of occupation, pushing day after day into territory that had been under German control. The breakout from Normandy, which would take weeks and cost tens of thousands more casualties, was built on the foundation that the 1st Division established on Omaha Beach. The soldiers who pressed inland in those early days were writing history with their bodies and their determination. Some would not survive the next few weeks. Others would carry the memory of Normandy for the rest of their lives. The division would go on to fight across France, into Germany, and to final victory in Europe. But Omaha Beach remained the crucible, the trial from which the 1st Infantry Division emerged as one of the most formidable combat organizations ever assembled. The cost had been devastating. The cost would continue to mount through the autumn and winter and spring that followed. Yet standing on that beach on the evening of the 6th of June, as the tide came in and the firing gradually slackened, survivors of the 1st Division could know that they had done something that would echo through history. They had breached Fortress Europe. They had paid for every meter with blood and courage and sacrifice. The beachhead at Normandy was secure, but it was a prison of its own making. The 1st Division, having clawed its way inland from Omaha Beach in the chaos of June, now faced a new and equally punishing enemy, the bocage. This patchwork of sunken roads, dense hedgerows, and small fields had transformed northern France into a maze of ambush points and killing grounds. The Germans, though retreating, had dug in with the skill of an army that understood how to make ground count. For the men of the Big Red One, the weeks following their June beachhead were less a triumphant advance than a slow, grinding struggle through terrain that rewarded patience and ruthlessness in equal measure. The division found itself locked in a attritional battle that tested not just their combat skill, but their capacity to sustain momentum when every field, every hedgerow, every sunken lane promised a sniper's bullet or a burst of machine gun fire. The casualty rolls grew longer with each passing day, and yet the division pressed forward, knowing that breakthrough was possible only if they could break the psychology of German resistance. By early July, the 1st Division remained locked in the bocage south of the invasion beaches, their progress measured in kilometers per day rather than kilometers per week. The division's new commanding general, Major General Clarence Hübner, had assumed command in late May, and he inherited a force that had learned to be lethal but was still learning how to be efficient. The fighting around Caumont and the approaches to Saint-Lô tested every lesson the division had absorbed in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Artillery preparation rarely dislodged the Germans, for the hedgerows provided natural bunkers that no amount of shell fire could completely neutralize. Armor encountered constant ambush from anti-tank guns, hidden in farmsteads and tree lines. Infantry had to clear each field and each hedgerow position almost by hand, using grenades, rifles, and bayonets in a brutal intimacy of combat. The division's veterans understood that speed was impossible in such terrain, but they also understood that any delay meant more casualties and more time for German reinforcements to organize their defenses. The breakthrough everyone anticipated came in late July, when American forces launched Operation Cobra, the massive assault designed to break out of the bocage and drive toward Brittany and the interior of France. The 1st Division was positioned to exploit this breakthrough, and when the opportunity came, they moved with a violence born of weeks of frustration. The collapse of German resistance following the intensive bombing campaign and the breakthrough near Saint-Lô opened a gap that no German commander could hope to seal immediately. Hübner recognized the moment and drove his division forward with an intensity that mirrored the urgency of the strategic situation. The division's reconnaissance elements pushed ahead in a swirling movement of jeeps, motorcycles, and light armor, searching for German rear areas and exploiting every weakness in the enemy's collapsing front. For the first time since landing at Normandy, the Big Red One could smell victory in more than just the abstract sense. The men who had languished in the bocage for nearly 6 weeks now found themselves advancing eastward in open terrain, where speed and firepower could finally combine into something approaching genuine maneuver warfare. The transition from hedgerow combat to mobile warfare required a complete mental shift for the division's leadership and troops alike. The tactics that worked in the bocage, careful movement, heavy reliance on artillery, deliberate assault, had to be abandoned in favor of rapid exploitation and aggressive reconnaissance. Armored infantry companies mounted their half-racks and pushed forward with minimal support, relying on speed and surprise rather than firepower to overcome enemy resistance. Tank platoons advanced ahead of infantry, probing German positions and collapsing them with concentrated fire before German gunners could organize their defense. Supply lines stretched across Normandy and into the advancing sectors, a logistical gamble that depended entirely on the division's ability to maintain momentum and prevent German counterattacks from severing their lines of communication. The division staff worked around the clock to coordinate movement, ammunition resupply, and medical evacuation for the mounting casualty rolls. What emerged was not a textbook operation, but a fluid, aggressive campaign, conducted by men and officers who had learned through bitter experience how to read terrain, anticipate German reactions, and move faster than the enemy could organize his defenses. As the Big Red One swept eastward through the countryside south of Falaise, they began to understand the scale of German collapse around them. The encirclement that would become known as the Falaise Pocket was forming as Canadian and British forces pressed south from the north, while American forces like the 1st Division advanced from the west and southwest. The Germans, caught between these closing pincers, faced a catastrophic choice: break through American lines and attempt a fighting withdrawal, or stand and fight in a shrinking pocket that grew more hopeless with each passing hour. The 1st Division encountered increasing numbers of German forces attempting exactly that breakout. Late July and early August became a series of sharp engagements as German panzer units and remaining infantry divisions sought to force their way through American positions. The division's soldiers found themselves in a grinding pursuit, punctuated by sudden, violent resistance from enemy units that had not yet accepted the reality of their situation. The Bocage, though now behind them, had taught the Big Red One's soldiers how to fight Germans on ground where the enemy could not easily withdraw. Those lessons proved invaluable now, as they pressed into the open country and encountered a desperate enemy fighting for survival. The pursuit reached its intensity in early August as German forces began their attempt to break out of the Falaise Pocket in earnest. The 1st Division, positioned along key routes of German withdrawal, found themselves facing waves of enemy forces attempting to break through their positions. These engagements had a different character than the Bocage fighting. The Germans were no longer defending fixed positions but attempting to force their way through American lines through sheer aggression and concentrated firepower. The division's artillery, now moved forward to keep pace with the advancing infantry and armor, became the killing instrument that could turn German columns into graveyards. American gunners, working with spotters who observed from advanced positions, could rain fire on German concentrations with devastating accuracy. Tank crews learned to position themselves on high ground where they could dominate German approaches and destroy enemy armor before it could close the distance. Infantry, no longer bogged down in house-to-house fighting, could move with speed and initiative, establishing blocking positions and ambushes that caught German forces as they sought escape. The casualty figures mounted steeply on both sides, but the disparity grew more extreme in favor of the Americans with each passing day. The psychological dimensions of this breakthrough and pursuit were as significant as the tactical ones. The 1st Division soldiers had entered the European campaign a year and a half earlier in North Africa, with the aura of a new army still learning its craft. They had been bloodied in Tunisia and Sicily, tested in Italy, and nearly broken on the beaches at Normandy. Now, in late summer 1944, they moved through France as a confident, experienced force that had learned to read the terrain, anticipate enemy movements, and execute complex maneuvers at speed. German prisoners, when captured, often expressed a kind of fatalistic resignation about their fate. They had heard of the American divisions that were pushing them eastward. They knew about the divisions that had fought in Africa and Sicily and Italy. The reputation of the Big Red One, earned through nearly 2 years of continuous combat across 2 continents, preceded them. Officers and non-commissioned officers had learned their craft the hard way, through experience rather than textbook study. They knew when to push and when to consolidate. They knew which officers could be trusted in difficult situations and which ones made poor decisions under pressure. The division had evolved from a collection of citizen soldiers into something far more formidable, a veteran combat unit that understood its own capabilities and was beginning to sense that German defeat was not merely possible, but inevitable. The logistics of maintaining an advancing division across the expanse of Normandy and into the French interior presented challenges that tested the division's supply apparatus as severely as enemy fire tested its combat units. Ammunition had to move forward constantly, for the artillery fire that was breaking German resistance consumed ordnance at a staggering rate. Food, water, and medical supplies had to keep pace with the infantry and armor as they pushed deeper into France. The division's quartermaster and supply officers worked in coordination with divisional headquarters to predict where the division would be in 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, and position supply dumps accordingly. Truck convoys, vulnerable to German air attack and ground ambush, moved day and night to keep the advancing elements supplied. Medical personnel established field hospitals and aid stations that leapfrogged forward as the division advanced. Maintenance crews worked to keep the division's vehicles and weapons operational despite the constant strain of sustained combat. The logistics of warfare at this scale and tempo were as demanding in their way as the combat itself, and any failure in supply could have broken the division's ability to maintain its advance. The momentum that the 1st Division achieved in late July and early August 1944 fed on itself in a way that became almost self-perpetuating. Each day's advance brought new intelligence of German movements. Each engagement, despite its violence, resulted in German forces being pushed further back and their options becoming more constrained. The division's leadership, particularly Hübner and his regimental commanders, understood that the Germans were in collapse, and that the only way to exploit such a collapse was to maintain the initiative relentlessly. Rest days were few. Troops rotated through reserve positions for brief periods, but the pressure on the enemy could not be released without risking German consolidation. The casualty toll mounted steadily, but it was understood as the cost of victory. The division's medical personnel worked to evacuate the wounded and return the lightly wounded to combat. The division's replacement system funneled new soldiers into the units to fill gaps left by casualties. The organization, though battered and tired, maintained its coherence and continued to function as a unified combat instrument. By early August, as the Falaise pocket contracted around the remaining German forces, the 1st Division found itself at the culmination of its breakout pursuit. The Germans still fought in many areas, but their situation had become hopeless. Entire divisions had been surrounded. Thousands upon thousands of Germans surrendered as their attempts to break through American lines failed. The division counted its casualties and absorbed replacements for the losses it had sustained. The pursuit had cost the Big Red One dearly, in killed, wounded, and missing soldiers. But the division had achieved something that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier in the Bocage. It had broken through German defenses, participated in the encirclement of German forces, and had inflicted devastating losses on the German army. The lessons learned from this pursuit would shape how the division approached future operations. Speed and aggressiveness had been rewarded. Units that moved forward had found success, while units that consolidated too quickly had allowed German resistance to harden. The breakout from Normandy and the pursuit of German forces through the summer of 1944 transformed the 1st Infantry Division's understanding of what it could accomplish. They had entered the Bocage as an army, learning how to defeat the Germans in terrain, where the Germans held the advantage. They had exited it as a division that had learned to exploit German weakness and pursue enemy forces with a ferocity and efficiency that German commanders could not counter. The advance eastward through France brought the division closer to Germany itself. The beaches of Normandy, where so many soldiers had fallen just weeks earlier, now seemed almost a preliminary test compared to the challenges that awaited them. The Big Red One sensed, as it pushed eastward in late summer, that the war was turning decisively in the Allies' favor. But no one who had fought through the Bocage and pursued the Germans through the rupture of their front could imagine that the fighting would become easier, or that the path to final victory would be anything less than a continuation of the grinding, terrible struggle that had defined warfare on the European continent. The division's pursuit extended through August as German forces withdrew in increasingly disorganized fashion toward the Seine River and beyond. The Big Red One, driving forward relentlessly, captured towns and territory at a pace that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The soldiers of the division understood, even as they fought, that they were part of something historically significant. They were not merely fighting for their lives, but for the defeat of an enemy that had seemed unbeatable when the war began. The exhaustion was profound. The psychological strain of continuous combat, the weight of ammunition and equipment, the constant awareness that death could come without warning, all of it accumulated with each passing day. And yet the division pressed forward, understanding at some fundamental level that momentum had to be maintained, that the Germans had to be denied time to reorganize and consolidate new defensive positions. The breakout and pursuit of summer 1944 represented the 1st Division at its peak, experienced, confident, ruthless, and driven by a collective will to see the war through to its conclusion on German soil. As August drew to a close, the 1st Division stood on the brink of a new phase of the war. Behind them lay the Bocage and the grinding struggle to break out of the beachhead. Behind them lay the pursuit across France and the destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket. Ahead of them lay Germany, the Siegfried Line, and the realization that even defeated, the Germans would fight with a desperation born of knowing they faced invasion on their home soil. The division had come a long way from the first days of June, when soldiers stumbled ashore at Omaha Beach and discovered that war was far more terrible than they had imagined. They had learned, adapted, and emerged as one of the finest fighting divisions in the American Army. What awaited them in the autumn and winter would test even their hardened resolve, but they faced the future knowing they had already overcome challenges that would have broken lesser units. The Big Red One was moving toward Germany, and nothing short of catastrophe could now stop them. By the autumn of 1944, the 1st Infantry Division had traveled nearly 800 kilometers from the Normandy beaches, and with each mile eastward, the soldiers understood that they were approaching something unprecedented in the American war against Germany. The Bocage fighting of Normandy had hardened them. The pursuit through France had quickened their pace. But now, as September gave way to October, the men encountered a landscape transformed into a military frontier, and beyond that frontier lay Germany itself, not as an abstraction or a distant enemy nation, but as walls of concrete, steel, and earth that blocked the way forward. The Siegfried Line, that formidable series of German defensive fortifications stretching from the Netherlands to the Swiss border, rose before them like a statement written in iron. It was no longer cavalry in pursuit. It was no longer breakthrough and exploitation. It was now, once again, what so many soldiers had hoped never to encounter again: prepared defenses manned by an enemy fighting on its own soil, with supply lines running backward into its own nation, with nothing left to lose and every reason to stand and fight. The Siegfried Line, known to the Germans as the West Wall, represented the accumulated effort of years of German military planning and construction. Beginning in 1936, German engineers had labored to build a complex of pillboxes, dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, trenches, and barbed wire that constituted the most formidable defensive line Germany had constructed since the trenches of the First World War. Along its entire length, concrete bunkers of various types, some designed for machine guns, others for artillery observers, still others serving as command posts or ammunition magazines, commanded every approach. The line was not a thin wall, but a deep defensive system with multiple positions arrayed in depth, so that penetrating the outer belt of fortifications meant merely entering a zone where further belts of defenses awaited. Some sectors were more heavily fortified than others, and the 1st Division's approach route took it toward the northern sector of the Siegfried Line, in the vicinity of Aachen and the German Rhineland, where terrain provided the defenders with natural advantages, and where German garrison units had prepared their positions with characteristic thoroughness. The division's intelligence officers had studied aerial photographs, interviewed prisoners, and studied maps, but nothing could fully prepare soldiers for the first sight of those concrete bunkers emerging from the German landscape, like tombs that refused to allow passage. The crossing into Germany itself came in early October 1944, and the moment carried a weight different from every preceding operation. Soldiers crossed the Belgian border. They moved through territory that had been German since the 19th century, and the psychological barrier proved as formidable as any physical obstacle. This was enemy soil, the homeland of the nation the 1st Infantry Division had been fighting across a continent for 5 months. The air seemed different. The architecture was German. The people they encountered were German civilians, and their presence transformed the war from an abstract struggle into something immediate and particular. Some of those civilians had fled eastward before the American advance. Others remained, cautious and uncertain, watching from windows and doorways as the American columns passed. The division's soldiers were under strict orders regarding fraternization with German civilians, and yet the proximity of those civilians, the evidence that this was someone's home and someone's nation, affected the men in ways that the senior officers may not have fully anticipated. The enemy was no longer distant or foreign in quite the same way. It was here, in the houses and fields and villages of the Rhineland. The first serious encounters with the Siegfried Line came in early October, when divisional units probed forward toward the concrete obstacles and bunkers. The German defenders, aware of American movements and possessing excellent fields of fire across the open terrain approaching their positions, opened fire with artillery and machine guns. It was not the chaos of mobile breakthrough warfare, but methodical, coordinated defense. American units attempting to move directly against the bunkers found themselves subjected to interlocking fire from multiple bunkers, anti-tank guns, and artillery positions arrayed in depth. The Dragon's Teeth obstacles, concrete pyramids roughly 1.5 meters tall, planted in dense patterns across the landscape, could not be easily destroyed, and they forced American infantry and vehicles into narrow gaps where German defenders could focus their fire with lethal precision. Casualties mounted rapidly in these early probes, and the division's commanders realized that this was not a problem that could be solved with speed and agility. The Siegfried Line would have to be methodically breached, sector by sector, bunker by bunker, through an application of overwhelming force and coordinated assault tactics that harked back to the worst days of the First World War. The division adopted siege-like tactics suited to the deliberate destruction of fortified positions. Engineers with tanks and infantry support concentrated on destroying individual bunkers, using demolition charges, flamethrowers, and direct fire from tanks and anti-tank guns to neutralize defenders and collapse fortifications. It was grinding, brutal work conducted under enemy fire, and the men who participated in these assaults knew that every bunker they destroyed came at the price of casualties among their own units. The German defenders, fully conscious that retreat was now impossible, they were fighting in Germany itself, and any retreat would lead further into German territory rather than toward any safe haven, fought with a desperation born of the recognition that the war was truly lost. They no longer fought for victory, but for delay, for the possibility that some political change or military miracle might alter the calculus of defeat. The American soldiers, aware that the war could last months longer or years longer, depending on how hard the Germans fought, pressed forward with grim determination. There was no exultation in this fighting, no triumph in small victories, only the steady accumulation of ground won and casualties sustained. In mid-October, the 1st Division shifted its focus toward Aachen, the first German city of significant size to face capture by American forces. Aachen held symbolic importance as the ancient seat of Charlemagne, as a German city and cultural center, and as the first populated urban center that American forces would have to assault within German territory. The approach to Aachen required the 1st Division to maneuver around the strongest points of the Siegfried Line while maintaining pressure to prevent German reinforcement of the city itself. The division's units moved through forested terrain and across open ground, encountering German resistance that was fierce but ultimately unable to prevent the Americans from bringing overwhelming force to bear. German commanders, recognizing that Aachen was becoming surrounded, evacuated most of the civilian population, though some remained in the city as American forces drew close. The division's artillery pounded German positions for days, and American planes dropped bombs on installations and ammunition dumps that supplied the German defenders. The assault on Aachen itself began in the final week of October, and the 1st Infantry Division was part of the force that pressed into the city from multiple directions. Urban warfare, with its close-quarter fighting in streets and buildings, with its dangers of ambush and concealment, required tactics entirely different from open-field combat, or even village fighting. American units moved through the streets, clearing buildings methodically, using tanks to support advancing infantry, calling in airstrikes on German strongpoints that resisted. The German garrison, aware that the city was being surrounded and that further resistance only delayed the inevitable, gradually fell back toward the center of Aachen. The fighting was intense and focused, not the chaotic street-by-street assault that American commanders had feared, but rather a systematic clearing operation conducted with growing efficiency as the 1st Division soldiers became more experienced at urban combat. Civilians remained in some buildings and cellars, trapped between American attacking forces and German defenders, creating moral complexity for the Americans who had to conduct their assault operations while mindful of civilian casualties. By early November, German commanders recognized that Aachen could no longer be held, and they authorized the remaining German defenders to cease fire and surrender rather than sacrifice the entire garrison in a pointless final stand. The 1st Division accepted the surrender of thousands of German soldiers and secured the city for American military government. The capture of Aachen was symbolically significant. The first German city fallen to American forces, but it was also a reminder of the immense challenges ahead. The Siegfried Line extended for many more kilometers to the north and south of Aachen. Behind that line lay the Rhine River, a major barrier that would require its own crossing operation. Behind the Rhine lay German territory extending into the depth of the nation, containing more German forces, more prepared defenses, and a population increasingly aware that the war was lost, but still struggling to survive and endure whatever military catastrophe was coming. Throughout November and into December 1944, the 1st Division conducted operations to broaden the bridgehead it had established east of Aachen and to reduce remaining German positions in fortified areas. The Siegfried Line was breached, but German reserves had pulled back to the Rhine and to defensive positions further east. The intensity of combat had not diminished, and casualties continued to mount with each engagement. The soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, now thousands of kilometers from the beaches of Normandy and engaged in warfare on German soil, understood that the war was moving into a new phase. They were no longer fighting for breakthrough and destruction of an already weakening enemy. They were fighting against an enemy that was broken militarily, but still capable of resisting, still capable of inflicting casualties on American forces, still organized under a military hierarchy that continued to command and direct German operations even as the nation's strategic situation deteriorated toward inevitable collapse. The lessons learned in the fighting along the Siegfried Line and at Aachen shaped the 1st Division's approach to the operations that would follow through the winter and spring of 1945. The division had learned that despite the weakness of Germany's overall position, German soldiers could still fight effectively when deployed in prepared defensive positions. The division had learned that conquering territory required not only maneuvering around enemy forces, but also assaulting them directly when necessary, and that casualties could not be avoided when engaging an enemy defending its homeland. The division had learned that urban warfare required different tactics than open field combat, and that American soldiers could adapt and master new tactical problems when given proper leadership and support. These hard-won lessons would inform the final campaigns of the war in Europe, as the 1st Infantry Division and its sister units pushed deeper into Germany, encountered the last desperate German defensive efforts, and witnessed the collapse of Nazi Germany in the final months of 1945. As 1944 drew to its close, the 1st Division found itself no longer pursuing a weakened enemy, but rather engaged in a war of attrition against a foe defending territory it could not abandon. The men who had stormed Normandy's beaches, chased German forces across France, and penetrated the first serious defensive positions Germany had erected, now faced the prospect of months of continued combat as they advanced deeper into German territory. The Siegfried Line was breached, Aachen had fallen, but the war showed no signs of ending quickly. Behind every hedgerow and every forest, German forces remained. Beyond every river crossing lay more German territory, more German forces, and more fighting still to come. The 1st Infantry Division, now blooded by combat across an entire continent, steeled by discipline and experience, would have to endure one more winter of war and a final spring offensive before Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender would bring an end to the fighting that had consumed Europe for nearly 6 years. By autumn of 1944, the 1st Division had crossed the Rhine in the previous chapter and now faced the grim mathematics of modern warfare. They had liberated Paris. They had breached the Siegfried Line. They had fought through the rubble of Aachen, the first major German city to fall. The men were exhausted. Equipment needed repair. Replacements arrived daily, many of them 18-year-olds who would never see their 19th birthday. The division held positions along a line stretching from the Belgian-German border northward, a sector considered relatively quiet compared to other areas of the front. This quiet, however, was deceptive. Behind German lines, something extraordinary was being prepared. Adolf Hitler, though his military situation had become desperate, had authorized one final, massive offensive. He believed that a sudden breakthrough in the Ardennes region could split the Allied armies, isolate the British to the north, and force the Americans to negotiate peace. The plan was ambitious. It was also, in many respects, rooted in fantasy, but it would transform the winter of 1944 into one of the most dangerous periods the 1st Division would endure. On the 16th of December, before dawn broke over the snow-covered forests of Belgium, German artillery began to roar. The bombardment was unlike anything American soldiers in that sector had experienced since D-Day. More than 1,400 guns and rocket launchers fired simultaneously, a stunning concentration of firepower that shattered the morning silence and sent shells raining down on American positions. The assault struck the 1st Division's lines with terrifying force. German panzer divisions and motorized infantry units, concealed until the last moment, launched their attack across frozen roads and through thick pine forests. The weather, overcast and bitterly cold, grounded Allied aircraft. The Americans were alone. Intelligence officers had suspected something might be brewing, yet the scale and timing of the offensive caught most units off guard. The 1st Division, stretched thinly across its assigned sector, faced the sudden appearance of enemy forces in overwhelming numbers. Men who had fought across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy suddenly found themselves pushed backward, a sensation many had not experienced in months. The chaos of those first hours crystallized the shock of the German surprise. Units became separated. Communication lines broke down. Company commanders lost contact with battalion headquarters. The Germans, unlike the Americans, had the advantage of preparation and knowledge of terrain. They had rehearsed their assault. They had marshaled fuel and ammunition. They knew where they would strike. The 1st Division, meanwhile, had to improvise, adapt, and resist while under extraordinary pressure. Young soldiers, some of them having arrived in Europe only weeks earlier, found themselves fighting in the snow against panzer units and SS divisions. Some surrendered. Others held their ground with desperate determination. Veteran officers and non-commissioned officers, the backbone of any fighting unit, rallied what troops they could and organized defensive lines using whatever natural or artificial obstacles they could locate. The cold became another enemy. Temperatures dropped to well below freezing. Frostbite killed and maimed as efficiently as bullets. Ammunition grew scarce. Supplies ran low. The 1st Division, like other American units in the breakthrough sector, had to wage a fighting withdrawal, trading ground for time while higher command attempted to reorganize the defense. Within 24 hours of the initial assault, it became clear to General Eisenhower and his commanders that this was not a localized probe or limited offensive. This was a genuine attempt to break through the American lines and achieve a strategic victory. The Supreme Commander began moving reserves northward. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding British forces, was given overall authority in the northern sector. General Omar Bradley retained control of American forces in the southern area of the breakthrough. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, received orders to pivot northward and strike the German flank. The 1st Division, meanwhile, continued to fight in place, holding positions near Malmedy and other key terrain. The fighting was savage and personal. German paratroopers dropped behind American lines. Spearhead panzer units pushed deeper into Belgium. capturing fuel and supplies that they desperately needed. American units fought roadblock to roadblock, delaying the German advance while buying time for the overall Allied defense to coalesce. The Big Red One, as it had done so many times before, became the anvil upon which the German assault would ultimately break. The second day of the offensive saw the 1st Division falling back under sustained pressure, but the withdrawal was deliberate and controlled. Officers and sergeants established rally points. They organized counterattacks to buy additional time. They held key villages and crossroads as long as possible before withdrawing to new positions. The Germans, despite their initial surprise and momentum, found that American soldiers would not break, would not flee in panic, and would not surrender except as a last resort. The 1st Division had learned through years of combat how to absorb a shock, reorganize under fire, and continue fighting. Losses mounted. Frostbite casualties equaled combat casualties. Men huddled in frozen holes, returning fire at attacking formations that seemed to have unlimited reserves of men and machines. The division's artillery, pulled back but still engaged, harassed German columns and disrupted assembly areas. Close air support remained impossible due to weather, but the artillery became the division's shield and the soldiers' confidence that they were not entirely abandoned. By the 19th of December, 3 days into the German offensive, the situation had stabilized somewhat. The initial German penetration, while significant, had not achieved the breakout that Hitler had envisioned. American units had inflicted substantial casualties on the German forces. The weather began to clear. Allied aircraft, finally able to operate, appeared over the battlefield in increasing numbers. The 8th Air Force and 9th Air Force launched thousands of sorties against German columns, supply lines, and assembly areas. The 1st Division, still fighting a delaying action, could now feel the momentum beginning to shift. German units, starved for fuel and hammered from above, began to slow. Some panzer divisions that had advanced deeply into Belgium found themselves running out of gasoline, stranded in the snow like steel beasts waiting for a kill they would never receive. The 1st Division's role evolved from desperate resistance to active counterattack. American divisions to the south, including elements reinforced from other sectors, began to press northward. General Patton's Third Army, driving hard from the south, began to squeeze the German breakthrough from an unexpected direction. By Christmas 1944, the 1st Division had transitioned from fighting a defensive battle to participating in a counteroffensive. The psychological shift was profound. Men who had spent a week fighting in retreat now found themselves pushing forward again. The initial shock of the German surprise had given way to determination and anger. German prisoners of war who were captured in increasing numbers expressed surprise at the ferocity of American resistance. They had expected to achieve a breakthrough quickly. They had anticipated that American soldiers, caught off guard, would surrender or flee. Instead, they encountered an enemy that, though caught by surprise, refused to break and continued to fight with skill and determination. The 1st Division's casualties during this first week of the Ardennes campaign were heavy. Hundreds of men were killed, thousands were wounded, many more suffered from cold injury, yet the division maintained its cohesion. Supply lines, once broken, were re-established. Reinforcements arrived. Equipment, damaged or lost, was being replaced or repaired. The division's identity as the Big Red One, the unit that had faced hardship and emerged victorious, reasserted itself even in the depths of the winter counteroffensive. The first week of the Ardennes campaign revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the 1st Division after nearly 2 years of sustained combat. The strengths were evident in the way experienced officers and sergeants responded to crisis, the way soldiers held their positions despite overwhelming odds, and the way the division maintained discipline and cohesion under extraordinary stress. The vulnerabilities were equally apparent in the high number of green replacements who had not yet developed the experience and confidence of veteran soldiers, the stretched supply lines that made ammunition and fuel scarce at crucial moments, and the physical exhaustion that comes from continuous combat over months. Yet the division adapted. Combat effectiveness depended not on perfect conditions or unlimited resources, but on the will to fight, the training to execute, and the leadership to inspire. The 1st Division possessed all three. Losses could be replaced. Equipment could be repaired or replaced, but the intangible qualities of leadership, unit cohesion, and fighting spirit, these could not be purchased or manufactured. They emerged from shared hardship and the knowledge that men had fought beside each other through years of war. The middle weeks of January 1945 saw the 1st Division playing a key role in the counteroffensive that squeezed the German salient from multiple directions. Units advanced against stiffening resistance as German commanders realized their breakthrough had failed and began to consolidate defensive positions. The fighting remained intense and cold. Soldiers advanced through snow and ice, through forests where German machine gunners had established overlapping fields of fire, through villages where house-to-house fighting could consume entire companies. The division pushed northward and eastward, gradually linking up with other American forces and closing the pocket that had been created by the German breakthrough. German units attempted to extricate themselves, to escape the encirclement, but American forces harassed their retreat and inflicted terrible losses. By late January, the Battle of the Bulge, as it would come to be called, was effectively over. The German offensive had failed. German armies had suffered catastrophic losses that they could never replace. The 1st Division had played a critical role in halting and reversing the offensive. The legacy of the Ardennes campaign for the 1st Division was mixed. The division had proven its resilience and fighting capability under the worst imaginable conditions. It had demonstrated that well-trained and well-led American soldiers could adapt to surprise and danger and emerge victorious. Yet the cost had been extraordinary. More than 8,000 soldiers of the 1st Division had been killed, wounded, or captured during the Ardennes operations. Winter casualties from frostbite and exposure had nearly equaled combat casualties. The division was exhausted. Equipment was worn out. The men had been fighting continuously for months, and the Ardennes campaign had pushed many of them to the edge of human endurance. Yet even as the Battle of the Bulge ended, the 1st Division received new orders. The war in Europe was not over. Germany still had to be invaded and defeated. The next offensive would carry the 1st Division across the Rhine and into the heart of the Third Reich. But that story belongs to the chapters ahead. For now, the Big Red One could rest, regroup, and prepare for the final push that would bring the war to an end. The winter of 1944 had tested the 1st Division as few things had. The initial shock of the German offensive, the desperate fighting in the snow and cold, the slow, grinding counteroffensive in January, all of these had demanded everything the division possessed. Soldiers had learned that war was not a linear progression from beginning to end, but rather a series of crises that emerged without warning and had to be met with skill, courage, and determination. The division that emerged from the Ardennes campaign was different from the one that had entered it. It was more hardened, more experienced, and more aware of the cost of victory. Yet it was also more confident. The men of the 1st Division knew that they could survive anything that the enemy threw at them. They had proven it in the worst winter and under the most desperate circumstances. As they looked toward the Rhine and the final offensive into Germany, they carried with them the knowledge that they had overcome the last major German attempt to reverse the course of the war. The Big Red One would not break. It would not surrender. It would see the war through to the end. By the spring of 1945, the 1st Infantry Division stood at the threshold of Germany's final collapse. Winter had been cruel and exhausting, but it had not broken the men or their resolve. The division had learned, through 3 years of continuous combat from North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy to the winter forests of the Ardennes, that the end of a war is often its most brutal phase. Commanders knew this. Soldiers felt it in their bones. What lay ahead was not retreat or stalemate, but the rapid, violent unraveling of a nation fighting for survival. The Rhine River itself stood as a barrier, a final natural obstacle between the exhausted but still determined forces of Nazi Germany and the advancing armies of the Western Allies. The 1st Division would not be denied. After 5 years of war and nearly 3 years in continuous combat, they would cross that river and drive into the heart of darkness itself. The planning for the Rhine crossing began weeks in advance. Unlike the amphibious assault on Normandy, which had required months of preparation and hundreds of ships and craft, the Rhine crossing would be different in character, but no less complex. The river itself, swollen by spring snowmelt and defended in places by remnants of the Wehrmacht and SS units, presented a formidable obstacle. American commanders understood that the Germans would attempt to make a stand along the far bank. The 1st Division's role in this operation was critical. They would not lead the assault everywhere, but where they were committed, they would punch through and exploit the breakthrough with characteristic aggression. The crossing would require careful coordination of engineer units to establish and maintain bridgeheads, assault troops to seize and hold ground on the far bank, and rapid reinforcement of follow-on forces. Every element had to function in concert. There was no room for hesitation or confusion. The assault came in late March 1945, south of Cologne and north of the main river confluence. The 1st Division crossed in the central sector of the massive American advance. Engineers had prepared assault boats and prepared the approach routes. Artillery positions had been laid out to provide covering fire. Air support had been arranged and coordinated. As darkness fell on the night of the crossing, assault companies of the division moved forward to the riverbank. The darkness was useful cover, though the spring night was cold and the water colder still. Men checked their equipment one final time. Officers reviewed objectives. The engineers prepared the boats and ropes and anchors that would ferry thousands of soldiers across one of Europe's greatest rivers. When the signal came, the first waves pushed off from the bank. Oars cut silently through the black water. Behind them, hundreds of artillery pieces waited to open fire if German defenses erupted. The Germans did resist, but their resistance was fragmentary and often poorly coordinated. In some sectors, fire erupted along the far bank as the assault boats reached midstream. Machine gun fire cracked across the water. Mortar rounds splashed and detonated. Men in the boats returned fire with rifles and carbines. Some boats were hit. Some men were killed or wounded before ever reaching the far shore. But the majority of the assault companies made it across and established their footholds on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Once ashore, the soldiers fought in the German villages and fortified positions just inland from the river. The combat was sharp but brief. German defenders, recognizing they could not hold the line, either surrendered or attempted to fall back toward new defensive positions further east. The 1st Division soldiers, by this stage of the war, had become expert at exploiting just such moments of German confusion and disorganization. Within hours, the first bridges were spanning the river. Engineer units worked frantically under continuing German fire to construct the floating bridges that would allow armor and heavy equipment to cross. Tank units waited on the western bank with engines running, ready to drive across the moment the bridges could support their weight. Trucks loaded with ammunition, rations, and reinforcements lined the roads leading to the crossing sites. The entire operation had the character of controlled chaos, transformed into methodical advancement. Officers directed traffic. Engineers hammered and shouted. Radio operators maintained the flow of information between units. Artillery continued to pound suspected German positions. By the morning after the assault, thousands of men of the 1st Division had crossed, and the first tanks were rumbling across the temporary bridges. The division now had a firm foothold on German soil east of the Rhine. The final phase of the European war had truly begun. What followed over the next 6 weeks was less a series of organized battles and more a rapid pursuit of a disintegrating enemy. The German army in this region, once the assault crossing had succeeded, ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. Units scattered. Command and control broke down almost entirely. Pockets of fanatical resistance continued in some towns and fortified positions, but the overall picture was one of collapse. The 1st Division advanced rapidly eastward, covering distances of 10 to 20 kilometers per day, sometimes more. Motorized columns moved along German roads, encountering sporadic ambushes and rearguard actions that were quickly suppressed. The division liberated German towns and cities one after another. Weary, half-starved German civilians emerged from basements and cellars to watch the American soldiers pass. Refugees moved along the roads in both directions, adding to the confusion and chaos of a nation in total defeat. The speed of the advance astounded even the commanders who ordered it. Supply lines stretched perilously thin. Gasoline became the critical constraint, not enemy resistance. The 1st Division would advance until fuel ran out, then pause while supply columns caught up. During these pauses, soldiers would rest briefly, resupply with ammunition and rations, and prepare for the next phase of the advance. German prisoners of war streamed to the rear in ever-increasing numbers. Some were remnants of combat units. Others were Hitler Youth or old men of the Volkssturm, conscripted into service in the final weeks of the war. The 1st Division's soldiers, hardened by years of combat, treated prisoners correctly but without sentiment. They were too exhausted and too focused on the mission at hand to waste emotion on the vanquished. The division's advance thrust toward the Elbe River and the meeting point, with Soviet forces advancing from the east. This geographic and strategic consideration drove the tempo of operations. American commanders wanted to advance as far and as fast as possible before the Soviets. The 1st Division, one of the most reliable and capable American formations, was pushed hard to achieve maximum distance. The division crossed the main river in early April. Then came the fighting in and around the town of Aschaffenburg, where German defenders mounted a more organized resistance. The division's infantry and armor forces executed coordinated assaults that cleared the town after several days of fierce street fighting. The pattern repeated in other towns and regions. German resistance would flare up, be rapidly suppressed, and the division would move on. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered, rather than continue a hopeless fight. As April progressed and German collapse accelerated, the 1st Division encountered the liberation of German concentration camps and forced labor camps. These discoveries shocked even soldiers who had witnessed 3 years of warfare. The skeletal remains of prisoners, the documentation of systematic murder, the photographs and records kept by the Germans themselves, revealed the true nature of the regime they had been fighting. Soldiers who recorded their reactions spoke of profound horror and a deepened conviction that the fight had been necessary. Whatever trials and costs the American soldiers had endured, the evidence of Nazi criminality justified every sacrifice. The division's men processed these discoveries as best they could and continued their advance eastward. History would later wrestle with the meaning of these horrors. For the soldiers of the 1st Division, the task at hand was to finish the war and link up with their Soviet allies. By early May 1945, the 1st Division had advanced into Bavaria and reached the vicinity of the Elbe River and the designated meeting area with Soviet forces. Advance patrols made contact with Red Army units. The lines had come together. The war in Europe was functionally over. German forces were either surrendering wholesale, being rapidly destroyed, or attempting to flee toward the American lines to surrender to the Western Allies rather than face Soviet capture. The 1st Division, which had landed on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June 1944, less than a year earlier, had crossed Germany from west to east and helped drive the final stake through the heart of Nazi Germany. The division accepted surrenders, processed prisoners, and took up garrison positions in the zones assigned to American occupation. The fighting was finished. The cost had been staggering. The 1st Infantry Division had suffered nearly 25,000 casualties since the Normandy invasion, including nearly 4,000 killed in action. The division's losses in the final campaigns in Germany added to this toll, though by April the division's casualty rate had dropped as German organized resistance collapsed. Officers and men looked back at the campaigns with a mixture of exhaustion, grief, and quiet satisfaction. They had been part of something enormous. The 1st Division had fought across 2 continents, defeated 2 major Axis powers, and helped to free millions of Europeans from totalitarian rule. The soldiers had grown from the raw recruits of 1942 to hardened professionals. Many would carry the scars of their service for the rest of their lives, both physical and psychological. Others would not return home at all. The transition from combat to occupation moved swiftly. The 1st Division, even as some of its units remained positioned in central Germany, began to be processed for either redeployment to the Pacific Theater or demobilization. Many soldiers who had served since the beginning of the war expected and hoped for rotation home. Others, particularly junior officers and non-commissioned officers, would remain in the occupation force. The division that had been known as the Big Red One, the unit that had bled on the beaches of North Africa and Sicily and Normandy, that had endured the winter of the Bulge, and that had driven across Germany in the final weeks of the war, now entered a new phase of service. Germany lay defeated and occupied. Japan remained unconquered. The men of the 1st Division, who had fought longer than almost any other American division in Europe, could not have known that this spring of 1945 would mark not the end of their story, but merely the transition to its next and more complex chapter. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled into ruin around them, the soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division found themselves occupying territory that only weeks before had been enemy heartland. The guns had not fallen silent everywhere. German forces continued fighting in pockets of desperate resistance, but the grand strategic collapse was irreversible. The division had fought its way across the Rhine, exploited gaps in German defenses with increasing speed, and now stood in control of towns and villages where the Nazi state had ruled unchallenged for 12 years. For men who had endured 5 years of warfare across 3 continents, the transition from combat to occupation presented a disorientation almost as profound as the first shock of enemy fire. The intensity that had sustained them through Normandy and the Ardennes could not simply be switched off. Instead, it transformed. The enemy was no longer organized into divisions and regiments, but dispersed across a civilian population, embedded in a culture of defeat, resentment, and uncertainty about what came next. The formal German surrender on the 7th of May 1945 came as both climax and anticlimactic release. Officers of the 1st Division received news of the unconditional capitulation through official channels, and the division's commanding officer, Major General Clarence Hübner, oversaw the implementation of surrender terms in his assigned sector. Hübner, who had replaced Terry de la Mesa Allen and proven himself a meticulous planner and decisive commander, now faced a different challenge entirely: the logistics of controlling enemy population, preventing looting and revenge killings, maintaining discipline among soldiers drunk on victory, and establishing the basic structures of military government fell upon him and his senior staff. The division's territory encompassed multiple towns and several thousand German civilians, former combatants mixed with refugees, Nazi Party officials alongside ordinary people who had simply lived under the regime. The challenge was not merely to accept surrender, but to maintain order, prevent chaos, and lay groundwork for whatever political structure would eventually govern occupied Germany. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, the soldiers of the 1st Division became administrators and police officers. They established checkpoints to process surrendering German troops, conducted searches for remaining weapons caches and Nazi Party records, and imposed curfews to prevent civil unrest. The division's engineers worked to restore basic infrastructure, roads, bridges, utilities, that had been destroyed in the fighting or neglected during the war's final chaotic months. Medical personnel treated both German civilians and any remaining German soldiers requiring care, extending professional courtesy to an enemy that had hours before been trying to kill them. This work was unglamorous and often frustrating. Soldiers accustomed to the clarity of combat found themselves navigating ambiguity, negotiating with German officials who claimed ignorance of atrocities, and attempting to distinguish between ordinary civilians and those who had actively perpetrated Nazi crimes. Trust was conditional and scarce. Every German was potentially suspect. Every interaction carried the weight of years of warfare and atrocity committed by Germany against peoples across Europe. The presence of forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, and displaced persons complicated the occupation further. As the 1st Division soldiers moved through their sector, they encountered the full horror of Nazi industrialized genocide. Survivors of concentration camps, work camps, and slave labor operations emerged from hiding or were liberated from facilities where they had been imprisoned. The division's personnel had fought for years against an enemy they could understand in military terms. They had adapted to the shock and brutality of combat. But the confrontation with evidence of systematic murder on an unprecedented scale produced something different, a moral shock that many soldiers struggled to process. Officers and enlisted men alike were ordered to witness evidence of these crimes, to ensure they understood what they had fought against, and to reinforce that this conflict had been about more than mere territorial control or ideological competition. For many, the encounter with this reality crystallized the meaning of their sacrifice in ways that tactical victories never could. The task of military government fell primarily to officers trained for combat rather than administration. The 1st Division, like other American military units in occupied Europe, operated under detailed instructions from higher headquarters regarding denazification, control of German resources, and prevention of Nazi resurgence. Officers established local administrations using German bureaucrats who could prove they had not been Nazi Party members or had not actively participated in regime crimes. This created a friction between justice and practicality. Many Germans with administrative experience had necessarily worked within Nazi structures. Finding officials completely untainted by the regime was often impossible. The division's command structure chose pragmatism over comprehensive purge, prioritizing stable administration and prevention of humanitarian crisis over ideological purity. This decision would be repeated throughout the occupation and would become a source of considerable controversy and debate in the years that followed. Relations between occupying soldiers and German civilians evolved gradually through the summer and autumn of 1945. Initial attitudes among American troops ranged from vengeful, particularly among those who had lost comrades to German resistance, to curious and sometimes sympathetic toward German civilians who claimed they had opposed the Nazi regime or had been powerless to resist it. The division's command issued strict orders prohibiting fraternization with Germans, particularly women, and threatening courts-martial for soldiers who violated these restrictions. Yet the orders were difficult to enforce. Soldiers were young men, German women were available and often willing, driven by hunger, the desire for protection, or simple human connection. The line between military occupation and the messy reality of human interaction across enemy lines proved porous. Officers tolerated low-level fraternization while maintaining formal prohibition, relationships that would have been unthinkable months earlier between conquerors and conquered became normalized through constant proximity and shared experience of the aftermath of war. The division's soldiers gradually became aware that their occupation would not be temporary. Plans for rapid demobilization and return to America gave way to the recognition that significant military presence would be required to enforce occupation terms, prevent German resurgence, and eventually facilitate reconstruction. The Soviet Union, America's ally in war, emerged after German surrender as potential adversary. The mutual suspicion that had simmered beneath the alliance during the war erupted into open tension. The 1st Division, along with other American formations, found itself not merely occupying defeated Germany, but potentially holding territory against Soviet expansion. Officers began recognizing that they might be stationed in Europe for years rather than months. This realization produced both resentment and adaptation. The soldiers who had endured 5 years of warfare now faced the prospect of indefinite occupation, far from home, in a country still reeling from defeat. Through the summer of 1945, the division's leadership implemented more formal structures of military government. They appointed German burgomeisters in towns and villages under their control, provided them with detailed instructions on administration, and held them accountable for maintaining order and supporting occupation forces. Rationing systems were established to feed the German population while preventing resources from flowing to any potential military resurgence. School systems were reopened with curricula purged of Nazi ideology. Newspapers and radio stations came under military control, disseminating information deemed appropriate by the occupation authorities. Churches were permitted to reopen, and religious leaders often became intermediaries between occupation forces and German populations. These structures represented, in practical form, the imposition of American order upon defeated German society. They were not harsh by the standards of military occupation, but neither were they permissive. The Germans existed under strict control, subject to searches, curfews, and the possibility of arrest based on suspected Nazi connections. The discovery and arrest of suspected Nazi war criminals fell to the 1st Division and other occupation units. Some of these individuals were prominent, high-ranking officials or Nazi party members known to have orchestrated crimes. Others were lower-ranking functionaries whose roles in atrocities were less apparent until investigation revealed their participation. The division's military police conducted interrogations, gathered evidence, and transferred prisoners to holding facilities awaiting trial. This work was often disturbing. It required confronting individuals responsible for murder, torture, and enslavement. It demanded that soldiers collect evidence that would later be used in prosecution. It forced recognition that evil often wore the face of ordinary men with bureaucratic responsibilities and family photographs. Some soldiers found this work meaningful, believing they were pursuing justice. Others found it morally exhausting, a continuation of conflict in different form, where the enemy no longer fought back, but was instead subject to interrogation, judgment, and imprisonment. As summer gave way to autumn, the division's soldiers settled into the routines of occupation. For many, this was worse than combat. Combat had been terrifying but purposeful. Occupation was monotonous and purposeless, requiring discipline and patience rather than courage. The men had been told they were liberators, that they were freeing Europe from tyranny. Yet liberation seemed to have accomplished little. Europe remained devastated, populations remained hungry, and the global order remained uncertain. The war in the Pacific continued, and there was growing speculation that the 1st Division might be redeployed there. The prospect of fighting the Japanese after having fought the Germans produced a complex emotional response. The soldiers had survived years of warfare. The thought of beginning again was exhausting. Yet for some, there was also a sense that the job was incomplete, that American forces must continue fighting until total victory was achieved. In early autumn of 1945, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered within days. The war that the 1st Division had fought across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany was suddenly over entirely. The division would not deploy to the Pacific. Instead, the soldiers faced the prospect of occupation duties in Europe for an indefinite period, then eventual demobilization and return to America. The news of Japan's surrender was greeted with relief, no more fighting, but also with frustration. The division would remain in Europe, maintaining order in a defeated nation, far from home, for as long as the occupation continued. The soldiers had endured the most intense warfare of the 20th century. They had survived when millions had not. Now they had to survive something perhaps more difficult, the patience and discipline required to occupy a defeated enemy while the machinery of demobilization ground slowly forward. By autumn of 1945, the 1st Division had transitioned from an assault formation to an occupation force. Their red one-shoulder insignia, earned through combat from Tunisia to Germany, now marked them as conquerors and administrators rather than soldiers in active warfare. They had defeated Germany. They had liberated millions from Nazi oppression. They had also seen horrors that no previous generation of Americans had encountered at such scale. They had learned that military victory did not automatically produce peace, that defeating an enemy's army did not resolve the deeper questions of how to govern, how to establish order, how to pursue justice against systematic criminality. The 1st Division's role in the occupation of Germany would extend through the autumn and into the following years, as the Cold War began to crystallize and occupation transformed into something more permanent, the stationing of American military forces on the European continent, a commitment that would endure through the remainder of the 20th century. The Big Red One had won its war. Now it would learn the far more complex and ambiguous lessons of peace. The post-war years had brought a peculiar numbness to the American military. 4 years after the victory in Europe, the 1st Infantry Division had settled into the routine of occupation and garrison life, rotating through Germany and home stations, training in an era when nuclear weapons promised that large-scale ground combat might never happen again. The soldiers of the Big Red One had earned their rest. They had fought from North Africa through Sicily, from Normandy to the Rhine, and they carried the scars, visible and invisible, of a war that had consumed nearly the whole world. But rest, as history would reveal, is a luxury that military institutions rarely enjoy for long. On the 25th of June 1950, North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel into South Korea, shattering the fragile peace that had settled over the peninsula. President Harry Truman made the decision almost immediately. The United States would intervene. Within weeks, orders arrived at military installations across America. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One that had earned its reputation against the Wehrmacht and Italian armies, was being reactivated for combat operations in a place most Americans could barely locate on a map. The deployment to Korea came with a sense of shock and incompleteness. The 1st Division was under strength, scattered across multiple posts, and many of its most experienced officers and soldiers had returned to civilian life in the years since 1945. The division that sailed for Korea in the summer of 1950 was therefore a hybrid force. Some hardened veterans who remembered the hedgerows of Normandy and the chaos of Omaha Beach, alongside younger men who had known only the relative peace of the occupation years. Training exercises in Japan provided only a brief window to shake off the rust. By early 1950, the 1st Division was already fighting. South Korea's forces had collapsed under the weight of the initial North Korean offensive. American units arriving in theater faced an enemy that had achieved tactical surprise and possessed superior numbers and equipment. The pressure was immense and the situation desperate. The division's task was to establish a defensive line against an opponent that seemed to have momentum on its side, and there was little margin for error. This was not the methodical, planned warfare of the European theater. This was reactive, immediate, and terrifyingly fluid. The Nakhtong River became the 1st Division's crucible, as North Korean forces pushed south and west, seeking to overrun the entire peninsula. The 1st Infantry Division established positions along this natural barrier in southeastern Korea. The Nakhtong was not a grand obstacle like the Rhine or the Seine, but in the brutal calculus of this campaign, it represented the line that must hold. If it did not hold, South Korea would fall. The American forces in theater were thin, stretched across